Okay, welcome back from break. We are now going to spend a little bit of time talking about BrainWorks and how it works. With BrainWorks, we use a tachometer as the teaching tool to help kids determine their current sensory speed, and then we use an arrow system to help them identify activities that will be beneficial to their sensory systems. So I'm just going to go over the three different types of kids first. Well, I really want to show you the tachometer first. Hang on a second. I typically in a live seminar I hold it up, but here we go. So here's the tachometer, and to keep track of how the tachometer works, it's best to think about what a car does at each of the colors on the stoplight. So if a car is at a red light, it's on stop. It's slow, it's sluggish, it's not going anywhere fast, right? If a car is on green, it's full speed ahead, which is fine. When we're comparing it to a kid, if a kid is on full speed ahead, that's fine on the playground. It's fine at recess. It's not a great indoor ready to learn speed though. So that's green. Yellow is just right because theoretically, when a car approaches a yellow light, it should be at the just right speed to where it could stop quickly if necessary, but it's allowed to keep going if it's safe to do so. So yellow really represents our ready to learn and focus speed. So yellow is what we think of as the just right speed the most of the time. And it's not that any of these speeds are bad. We never want kids to think one speed is bad and another is good. It depends on what we're doing. We all need to slow down and stop sometimes each day. We all need to be full speed ahead other times. But ready to learn and ready to focus is yellow. And so that's how we really want to think about it, right? Now, when we're talking about over responders, we think of them as being on green, and that's because their brains are too fast. Their brains are spinning, their brains are thinking about 33 things simultaneously, and their brains are not doing a good job of helping them focus on what's most relevant and filter out everything that is less relevant at the moment. Now, their bodies, the bodies of over-responders, may or may not be going fast. Some over-responders do go into what we call shutdown mode, where they look very sedentary and slow at that moment, but it's because their brains are spinning. Now, other over-responders may spin around in circles or beat their head on a wall to try to drown out the chaos. So in that case, their body would literally be going fast. So what we want to think about when we think about over-responders is their brains are going too fast, right? Their bodies may or may not be. So those are over-responders. We see them as starting on green. They need to calm down. Now let's go back to my slides here. Okay, so we picture over-responders starting on green because their brains are spinning. They need to be encouraged to choose red arrow activities, and I'll show you the inside of the folders that you can make in a minute. They need to choose red arrow activities to help them slow down, calm down, and relax. So they're going too fast, full speed ahead. They need brake pedal activities to help them slow down like a car would if they were approaching a red light. Now, our passive under-responders are seen as starting on red. They're like a car at a red light. They're slow, they're sluggish, they're not going anywhere fast. They need green arrow activities to help them perk up, wake up, and be alert. The green arrow activities are the accelerator pedal. The red arrow activities are the brake pedal. Our sensory cravers are seen as starting on green, full speed ahead, because their bodies are literally going fast. They're running and jumping and spinning and crashing. Here's the kind of confusing thing though. They're on green, but they need more green to help them reach that high threshold for input. In keeping with the analogy, the way that I explain that is to say, your gasoline tank has too much gasoline in it. And the quickest way to burn off the extra gasoline is with green arrow activities. So they're on green and they need more green. Kids get this. Once in a while, I find adults who are like, I don't think that makes sense to me. It makes sense to kids, I promise you. In fact, with your higher level kids, sometimes I have twice for sure, and more, I think, but twice I've seen these looks like, thank the good Lord, somebody finally gets me. Because think about what these kids are being told most of the time. They're being told, slow down, stop moving, sit still. And they're thinking, but I can't do that. It's a drive. I have to move. Moving powers my brain. And so finally, we're giving them permission to do what they already know they need. And they're like, whoo, this woman gets me, you know? So it's fun when you see that reaction in some of these kids. Okay, now these are the guidelines I was hinting at earlier, and then remembered that I had the slides, so I backed up. But we talked about how sensory cravers, if we just turn them loose on like a mini trampoline, they end up looking worse rather than better sometimes. It just seems like they get more revved up and more revved up, and then they're flying off the chart rather than hitting that healthy threshold. So neurologically, there's a lot going on. These guidelines are what will help us to structure their sensory breaks so that they actually reach the healthy threshold and don't end up looking worse rather than better. It's helpful if their sensory breaks are goal-directed. Rather than uninterrupted jumping on a mini trampoline, we want to give it a purpose, like jump while you count to 100 by tens, you know, or incorporate it into some kind of activity or game. We want their movement to be intermittent with lots of stops and starts. That seems to have some neurological power. We want to incorporate lots of head position changes. I'll show you how I do this in a minute. We want their movement to be mostly proprioceptive input or equal parts another form of input with proprioceptive input. Proprioceptive input is what keeps us grounded. It keeps us from getting too out of control. So we want to make sure if we're doing something vestibular in nature, we want to make sure the intensity of the proprioceptive quality is at least as high. So when we think about the mini trampoline example, they're getting proprioceptive input to their lower extremities, nothing to their upper body, but lots of very stimulating visual and vestibular input. If I want to think about increasing the proprioceptive quality of jumping on a mini trampoline, I might say, all right, while you jump on the mini trampoline, we're going to play catch with this weighted ball while you count to 100 by tens. That way I've made it goal-directed, I've increased the proprioceptive quality, and it gives a appropriate start and stop. When they get to 100, they're going to stop and we're going to do something else. Sometimes it's best to contain these kids in small spaces if possible. You can do that in a room just by putting up like room dividers or bookshelves to kind of keep them focused in that little zone. That seems to be helpful too. Dr. Lucy Miller has a good line, and I just memorized this line, and it helps me to guide my intervention with sensory cravers. Her line is, sensory cravers need functional interrupted stimulation. So to that end, often when I'm helping kids choose their activities for their sensory break from that file folder tool, I may say, you have 15 minutes for a break, so choose 5 activities. They choose 5, and then I put them on so I can control the order. That way I may put an activity where their head is vertical on the first spot, where their head is horizontal on the second spot, maybe inverted on the third spot, and so forth, as much as I can. They might not choose all of those positions, but I want to try to get some head position changes in there. That also provides definite stops and starts if they're doing multiple activities. And often I do combine that with count to 100 by tens, and then when you get to 100, then we move on to the next activity, and so forth. Or another great way to do that is to design a circuit out of the activities they choose. If they don't choose anything that might put their head in an inverted position, I may make that one of the transition activities. Like while you're transitioning from the mini trampoline to the I'm blanking, that thing that the body tube where you get in and you stretch against it, you know, or the crawling tunnel. I may say to slither like a snake, because that would put their head in a vertical position to get to the next thing on the circuit, something like that. So I still want it to be choice-based, but I can control the order of the choices. And I'll show you what that looks like in the folder in a minute. So as many of these elements as you can incorporate into the sensory breaks for sensory cravers, the better off you'll be in helping them reach that healthy threshold in a short amount of time and end up looking better rather than worse. Okay, so this is the outside of our BrainWorks file folder tools. The one on the right is the pre-printed version, which you can order, but you don't have to. The DIY version is what you'll be able to make with the membership that you're getting for participation in this course. And that allows you to select and print off unlimited numbers of cards, and then you're putting together this type of a tool. So the tachometer is on the outside of the file folder, and then we put some empty Velcro dots out here. And this, they choose the activities from the inside, they move them to the outside, and this becomes like a visual schedule to structure their sensory break time. So this, I'm gonna be in the cozy corner for about 5 minutes, and then I'm gonna do something alerting and something just right. There's a number of ways that you use this depending on the child, and I didn't set these up exactly. I just put some random things on here, but they know to move on. And you could do that with a timer. You could do it with counting to 100 by tens. There would be a number of ways that you could then encourage them to move on. Or sometimes I just say, good choices. Now you can do any of these 3 activities in any order until the timer goes off. If they end up spending most of the time on one activity, then hopefully that was a good thing. For over-responders and passive kids, it's not that big of an issue usually. As long as they're engaging in the right kinds of activities during their sensory break, the order of the activities doesn't seem to make that much of a difference. It's only with sensory cravers that you have to really take it up a notch and be more intentional about the order of their activities. To think about changing head position, making it goal directed, those kinds of things, okay? This is the inside of the pre-printed file folder kit, and this is where it explains our arrow system. So all of the cards have a little arrow in the upper right-hand corner. A red arrow pointing down means these strategies are going to help you calm down, slow down, and relax. A yellow arrow pointing in both directions means these activities help you get to the just right point, help you focus, help you pay attention. Green arrow pointing up means these activities are going to help you get going, perk up, or be alert. By the way, I always say you can always choose yellow. Most of our yellow activities are those good, wholesome, proprioceptive activities that are good for everybody. If you're overstimulated, they're going to bring you back toward normal. If you're understimulated, they're going to bring you up toward normal. So yellows are always good choices. So if you need red, you can choose red or yellow. If you need green, you can choose green or yellow. I often also have them end on yellow because it's kind of a good way just to get it back together again. So on the outside of the folder, I may have them choose a yellow strategy for the last spot so that they end with something that's mostly proprioceptive in nature. This is the inside of the DIY folder. I just take like 1/3 of a piece of cardstock or construction paper to put behind that section so the kids can clearly see where they return the yellow arrow activities to, where they return the green arrow activities to. Okay, here's some other things you can do with our sensory activity cards. This is the key ring tool. Sometimes I've made these for higher level kids who wouldn't be caught dead with a file folder in place, or those kids who, they're general ed kids, older kids. I know they probably won't even get this out in public, but I find some value in creating it together. So during my direct service time, I may lay out like 30 strategies that I think might be beneficial for the student. And I'm saying, choose about 10 to put on your key ring. And when they choose one, we talk about what time of day do you think you might need to use that strategy most often? Which class period would that be most helpful in? What equipment do we need to get in place for you? What can we do to make sure you're not a distraction to others while you're engaging in that activity? So it just helps generate some of that good conversation. And then even if they never get this out in public again, it's still something physical I can send them on their way with, and the adults in their life can say, remember to use your key ring strategies, things like that, okay? Okay, first then is something we can use for younger kids or kids who are more cognitively impaired, and this is just a very basic visual schedule. It's a little bit of a cognitive leap for people who have been using First Then in the more traditional manner. Typically in classrooms, teachers use it such that first represents a work task and then represents a reward or a choice activity, right? We're using it a little bit differently because we feel like sensory input is a need rather than a reward. So I want to make sure they get their sensory input not only after being compliant, I want to make sure they get it no matter what. But I find this is a good way to structure it because sensory input is almost always inherently rewarding, so kids look forward to it. Therefore, they're more motivated to get done with their first activity before moving on to then. Now, what we're really doing is we're setting up this cycle so that they work, get sensory input, work, get sensory input, work, get sensory input, because we want that steady flow of sensory input for these kids. The younger that we are and the more cognitively impaired we are, the more we need a steady flow of sensory input. That's why toddlers never stop moving, because they need that steady flow. We don't really start talking about sensory breaks, like you might use the file folder for, until kids are about kindergarten age. Ideally, when they're younger than that, we want hands-on learning environments where they're just inherently getting that steady flow. So if we're working with a child that's cognitively impaired or younger, this is a way of providing them that steady flow of input. So me or the teacher or the parent would put on the first activity. I'm choosing that. They choose the then. Now I can control their choices. If I know they're going to need an alerting activity after this, then I might hold up 2 or 3 alerting activities. Choose one, we put it on, we work, and then we get the trampoline. Now, the concern is always, what if he's naughty during the work time, and then he thinks I'm rewarding him for being naughty by allowing him to go onto the trampoline? Should I take away the trampoline? I don't feel like we should take away the trampoline. In fact, the naughtier he is during the work time, probably the more he needs the sensory input, right? So to prevent them from thinking we're rewarding them, I often use visual timers. If I'm working with a child in OT, I might set the timer for 60 seconds and say, we are going to work until the timer goes off, no matter what, even if it requires physical prompts or hand-over-hand assistance. But also, no matter what, when the timer goes off, we're all done, we move on to this. This is not a reward. This is simply the next thing on the schedule. And then we set the board up again. We're going to work for 60 seconds, and then we get the sensory input. So the timer takes away the confusion between whether it's a reward or whether it's just the next thing on the schedule. Okay, so that's one option for you. We can limit the choices based on what we know they need, but I still strongly believe it needs to be choice-based as much as possible. These are visual routines or sensory-based visual schedules. These I'm a huge fan of. I think this is where the magic typically happens. So you choose the target behavior, and as the OT, I'm typically not the one to choose the target behavior. I usually want those to come from the teachers or the parents, whoever's doing life with that kid on an ongoing basis. And so they give me the target behavior, and then I can set up this sensory-based routine to support that target behavior that we're hoping to change. This is an example of one for a boy who was mostly in general education, but he went into the resource room for language arts. And he hated language arts. It was this big, meltdown on the way and protests and refusals once he got there. So we implemented this, and the teacher or the parent puts on the non-negotiable. We are going to do language arts. So she had that on there upon his arrival, and she would say, we're going to do language arts soon, but you get to choose 2 strategies to get your brain and your body ready for language arts, 1 strategy to help you during language arts, and something to look forward to for after language arts. Now, again, I've created choice boards already of the types of activities that I know will be helpful to him. In this case, we had 3 different choice boards. One for the before strategies. We had a different choice board for strategies he could use during, like alternative seating or a weighted lap pad. And then highly preferred activities that he could choose from to look forward to. These are still chosen based on his sensory needs. For his after activities, I gave him only calming strategies to choose from because he often got frustrated and angry during language arts, and I knew he needed a chance to calm down and get it together again before he transitioned back to general education. So I'm thinking of the choices based on what I know he needs, but I'm still allowing it to be choice-based. So then he got to engage in these activities. He's in a better mood. It's choice-based. I want to participate because I made these decisions. He gets something during and something to look forward to afterwards. So it was really helpful in decreasing the behaviors that went along with that transition. So those are some different things you can do with your membership. We also have 2 different sets of forms that are very helpful just to print off. They're already created for you. You can print them off and give them to teachers or parents to hang on a wall to just help them remember the big picture of where you're going from a sensory diet approach. I'll show you these in a minute. Okay, now I want to take a minute to tell you how to get your free membership. If you don't already have a free membership, you get one for participation in this course. If you already have a free membership, you get a free single family or single classroom kit shipped to you. And I'll talk to you about how to get that later for those of you who are live. For those of you who are watching the recording of this, please refer to the instructions in your access email rather than listening to what I'm saying out loud right now, okay? Because the password changes frequently. So this is the current password to get your free membership, but this will not work for those of you who are watching the recording later, okay? So follow the instructions in your access email if you're watching the recording. But for those of you who are here live, this is what you're going to do. Go to this webpage, sensationalbrain.com/free. When you get there, it's going to ask for a password. And the current password is spring. It has an uppercase S and an exclamation point at the end. Spring, uppercase S, exclamation point. That you're only going to use that password once. Some people think they can actually log into the system with this password, but that's not the way it works. You'll use this password once and then you'll set up your own account. And then you'll have your own username and password that you use forevermore. I'll show you this process in just a minute. Okay, in fact, I'm going to show it to you now. So let me go here. Okay, so you'll see I'm already at sensationalbrain.com/free. And it's saying this is password protected. Enter your password. And the current password is spring with a capital S. I enter. And now it's opened up a form for me that I fill out. And this is where I choose my own username and password. Okay. And that's what I'm going to use forevermore. If it works, then you'll instantly receive an email saying, thank you for joining BrainWorks, etc. And then you can go log into the system. If it just refreshes, it probably means you're trying a username that's already in use and the system won't allow that. So try it again. And if it doesn't work, then email Celeste at sensationalbrain.com. She's my director of customer service, and let her know what you'd like your username and password to be, and she will finish setting up the account for you. Okay? All right, so once you have your free membership, from now on, you'll log in with your password and username. By the way, please do this process soon for those of you who are here live today, because that password will expire in about 2 weeks. So try to do this process soon. From now on, when you log in, you'll automatically be taken to the members area. Now, remember, it's unfortunate, the recording of this recording time, because our website is changing very soon, like in about 2 weeks. So what you're seeing on your screen today may not look like what it looks like 2 weeks from now, okay? So just know that, but you'll still, the basics will all still be there somewhere. It's just that the presentation will look different. We're going to, but you'll have the same options in the members area. I'm going to start at the bottom and talk my way up because we're going to spend the most time here. Here I have some sensory diet suggestions for specific target behaviors. These are printable PDFs on things like wrist biting, toe walking, masturbation, some of the biggies that I get a lot of questions about, and it's just how to get started approaching those behaviors from a sensory perspective. This is a downloadable printable product manual. And this has activity descriptions. So if you see a picture card, like we have one called the coffee grinder, if you don't know what that is, download this manual or print it, and we will give you an activity description for what that is. And for activities that involve equipment, we recommend substitutions in case you have a small budget. These are the 2 sets of forms I mentioned that are helpful to print off and give to parents and teachers. Here's a quick start guide that I'm kind of giving you out loud right now, so you may not need. This is where you can buy physical products in the future, if you ever choose to do so. Here are explanations and instructions for the DIY version of the file folder tools and the first then tool on sensory-based routines. And then here is where you're going to spend most of your time. Select and print BrainWorks sensory activity cards. So I'm going to click on that right now. And I'm just going to hide my instructions. This is web-based software, by the way. I'm going to hide my instructions so you can see more of my screen. Now, at first, it's kind of weird. You know, some of them are in Spanish, some are yellow arrow, some have a black border, some are green arrow. It just looks kind of discombobulated, and there's 42 pages of that. So it's not super helpful yet. You want to make sure to use these blue buttons at the top. Start by selecting your age group. Let's say I want to create a file folder tool for a school-age child. And then I select my activity type. I'm going to start by getting some calming strategies. Now the system has narrowed it down to all of the calming strategies that could be appropriate for school-age children. Now at this point, I'm just finding one that I think would be good for this kid, and I'm clicking and dragging it onto the template, like this. If you see the word next, be sure to click on it so that you can grab all of the activities that you think might be beneficial. Now I'm going to make a file folder, so I also want to get some Just Right activities while I'm here. And I may as well get a few greens for alerting. Okay, now after I get all of the activities that I want to print, I scroll down beneath the template and choose to print in 1.5 inch or 4 inch versions. I'm going to choose 1.5. The 4 inch is best for first then. 1.5 inch is more common for visual schedules. And now the system has created a PDF for me of the pictures I've chosen. And from here, I'm just going to print from my browser window, and then I'm cutting, pasting, and creating my different visual sensory diet tools. Okay? I'm going to go back to this page for a minute. I want to show you a couple of other features in here. Under this second column of options, this is where you would find some routine-based activities. We do not have arrows on these. You know, even if riding the bus is alerting for you, you still may have to do it. So we've left the arrows off, but there are enough here like eat, computer time, get dressed, make your bed, brush your teeth, go to school, language arts, math, PE, recess, things like that, that you could incorporate them into sensory-based visual schedules. However, this isn't our specialty. So if you need very specific picture cards to go over like the steps involved in toilet training or something like that, you may want to use pictures for PECs to represent the routine parts of a child's schedule, and then BrainWorks to represent the sensory activities that you're incorporating into the visual schedules. Kids do fine with a mixing of the systems like that. Or you can email us, and we're happy to make more picture cards for you if you have anything you want, either activity or routine-based. So no, that's an option. And then under the same second tab here, we have the teaching modulation pictures. We have the tachometer, which is most frequently used. We have a stoplight, which some people like to use. The only reason why we moved away from the stoplight, same analogy as with the tachometer, but some classrooms use the stoplight as a behavioral indicator, and we don't want kids to think if they're on red that they're in trouble, because your sensory speed is not morally good or bad, you know? So we don't want kids to think that. By moving toward the tachometer, kids don't even make that association. So that's a good way to go. Sometimes I use these emotion pictures instead. It's a little bit simpler. So I have 3 different sections on the folder still, and they choose how they feel. If they're feeling slow and sluggish, below that would be a selection of activities that could help them get back to just right. I'll show you more examples of all these in future slides. And then following that, we have all of our activities translated into Spanish. So if you're working with any families, that would be helpful for. They have the Spanish activity titles at the top. And at the very bottom of the second column, we have a version of our cards called BrainWorks Your Way. This is just a fully customizable version of our system. We've left off the colored borders and the colored arrows, so you can be as creative as you want to be. Some people work in schools that use the zones of regulation curriculum for teaching emotional regulation, and they want to be able to use our sensory activity cards to integrate into the zones of regulation program. But the zones colors are very different than our colors. So we've created this system. You could just choose the BrainWorks Your Way version. And then if I'm using zones of regulation, I would, if this is an activity that would be good for him when he's in the blue zone, I would outline it in blue. And then if I have some kind of a zones tool, I would put these activities in the blue section, meaning when you're in the blue zone, these are the strategies that are going to help you get back to green, because in zones, green represents just right. It's different than our system. So this card allows you to be as creative as you want. Or, one time I had a little girl in the clinic who just was, cheetahs were her thing. She always wore a cheetah print and she talked about cheetahs. So I thought, I'm going to use that. Cheetah represents fast, and she was a fast kid. And then I asked her, what kind of an animal goes slow? And she said a snail. So we used a cheetah and a snail, and then I would put cheetah and snail stickers on the back of each activity card, and that's how she made her determination. So with this BrainWorks Your Way card, you can do whatever you want with them. One other thing I want to show you. We do have this search box up here, okay? Let's say that if I'm looking for a scooter card. If I type it in, it's showing me the scooters, but only the black border version, because I have BrainWorks Your Way selected. So really the best thing to do if you're looking for something specific is to just deselect these options. Now if I type in scooter, it gives me all of the different options so that I can choose the one that I want, okay? So if you're looking for something specific, use the search box with neither one of these selections made. Okay, so that is our system. And those of you here live, let me know if you have any questions about how to get your membership or how to use the program. Meanwhile, I'm going to talk you through some other things available on our website. I told you earlier that you can always print out the checklist from our website. It's under the Forms tab. We have two different types of forms, some that are printable to the public, and then some that are only accessible if you're logged in. The free printable forms is where you'll find the different checklists. We have a few other things here too. We have a classrooms accommodations checklist, a home recommendations list. This is a printable, it's a couple pages of information to give to parents and teachers to help them understand sensory modulation disorder. Here is the original version of our checklist, which was included in your course materials today. We have a version of our checklist that's best for the birth to 3 population. We have a version that's best to be filled out by teachers. And then we have a version of our checklist that's translated into Spanish. So those are all there for you. If you're logged in, you can access the forms for members. And here we have some data tracking forms. We have the printable forms for parents and teachers. We have the sensory needs assessment summary and plan, which is included in your course material for today. That's a useful form to help you develop your plan. So that's all there if you're logged in. We have some other products. We have a wide variety of view-on-demand webinars available. We have a pretty extensive Q&A section. Things like, what do you do for a nose picker? Believe it or not, I've answered that question. And if you go here or type in nose picking in the search box, it will bring up some Q&As that I've had with other people in the past to help you kind of see like where I begin approaching those kinds of behaviors. Here's just some information pages that can be helpful to refer people to. Under the More tab, we have some things like how to make a weighted blanket, and so forth. Okay, so again, probably what I'm showing you today is not what it will look like for much longer, but the components will all be there somewhere. You're just going to have to play around with the new site a little bit, but I am excited about that upcoming change. Okay, I don't see any questions from our live participants, so I'm going to go ahead and go back to our PowerPoint here. There's usually the option to play from the current slide. Oh, here we go. Okay. All righty. So remember, for those of you who are here live, your password is currently spring with a capital S followed by an exclamation point. This will expire soon, so please do that process soon to set up your free membership. For those of you who are here live, if you already have a membership, send an email to me, Gwen@sensationalbrain.com, and tell me you already have a membership, but you attended this course, and request your single kit, BrainWorks kit, and give me your shipping address, and we will get that shipped for you soon, okay? That applies to the people who are here on View on Demand also. Send me an email. My email address is Gwen@sensationalbrain.com. Tell me you already have a membership, and then we'll verify that. And then send me your shipping address with a request for your kit, and we'll get that sent to you. Okay. Now we are ready to talk about some of the specific activities for modulation. So I'm going to go back to the website actually for just a minute. And okay, so I just want to talk to you about how we make the determination of which types of activities are calming versus alerting versus just right. In general, calming strategies are slow, rhythmic, they're stable, meaning they don't incorporate much change of head position or very little movement of the head through space. Lots of deep pressure and heavy work activities can also be calming by nature. I'm just going to kind of let you glance at different things that are considered to be calming so you start getting a feel for that. Weighted garments, deep pressure, these are the types of things we think of as being calming. Okay? Just right types of activities tend to be mostly proprioceptive or incorporate most of your muscles and joints simultaneously. Like when I'm sitting on a bolster, I'm having to contract to hold on with my arms and my legs to keep myself upright and stable. I'm using my core as well. I could make the same activity very alerting by pushing them in multi-directional fast manner. I could make it pretty calming, but in general, it's just right, okay? We think about just right strategies that use as many of the muscles and joints simultaneously as possible, like animal walks and so forth. But you'll still see most of these activities are not very action-packed as far as fast movement, rapid movements through space, rapid changes of head position. It's more repetitive types of activities that require multiple muscles and joints to be involved simultaneously. Okay? Those are the kinds of things we think of when we think of just right. Repetitive tasks like manipulative play, that usually gets us to that just right zone too, because we're actively engaged, but it's not novel. Alerting activities tend to involve movement of the head through space. They tend to be kind of fast, kind of fun, kind of intense. Cold water, frozen food, cold is an alerting type of input. Hanging, anytime we're kind of extracting the joint surfaces, that's very alerting in nature. It kind of activates our sympathetic branch of our nervous system to want us to keep our body in one piece. Any type of play fighting, fast, jumpy movements, those kinds of things tend to be alerting. Sour is alerting. Anytime we have extreme head positions like inversion or hanging upside down, very alerting. Let's see. Jumping is alerting. So lots of jumping activities. Anything that has a risky component to it or that might make you a tiny bit scared, like going down a scooter ramp, is alerting. Fast, multi-directional swinging is alerting. Head inversion is alerting. So, you kind of get better at this over time, but you just sort of think to yourself, how would that make me feel? If it's slightly scary, slightly exciting, slightly risky, it's probably green. If it's slow, rhythmic, those kinds of things are calming. Just right tend to involve multiple muscles and joints simultaneously, but not a lot of rapid head position changing. Okay, so those are some generalities for the types of activities. If I speak live, we usually have these little experimental centers, but we don't have that luxury today. So I just wanted to give you a little overview to give you a determination of how we make that. Now, there are some activities we have in more than one zone. You'll see some activities that will appear in the yellow cards and also appears on the red cards because it kind of depends on the person, and you can make that determination for the kids on your caseload that way. Okay, hang on, I want to, somehow my webcam went away and it's hard for me. There I am. Okay, it's kind of disconcerting if I know you can see me, but I can't see me because I want to make sure I'm in the middle of the screen and all that. Okay, now I'm back. By the way, the webcam is not captured on the recording. So for those of you watching the view on demand version, you won't be able to see that. And I know it does make it a little more boring. If you're a visual person, I would encourage you to sign up for our live webinars so that you have that extra component of being able to see the speaker. But they're not captured on the recording. I'm not even entirely sure why. Okay, now we are ready to start talking about putting it all together, using the assessment information to create a sensory diet for the child who we're trying to help. From our assessment, no matter what we're using, we might be using the SIBT, we might be using the EASY in a couple years, we might be using the sensory profile or the processing measure, or a good checklist. Whatever we're using or whatever combination, what we have to end up knowing is what are they over-responsive to and what are they under-responsive to, because that's how we're going to create our sensory diet. Once we have that information, we're going to analyze the target behavior in light of the sensory issues. So, for example, I start by asking myself, does this behavior make sense based on what I know about the student? And usually I'll end up thinking, yes, that does make sense. Like if I hear about a student who cannot stay seated, and I look at his checklist and I see that he craves vestibular input, then I think, yeah, that makes sense that he has a hard time staying seated, right? But there may be another behavior, like sometimes, aggression is one that often comes up with parents. Parents don't like to think that it's possible that their little angel is ever mean or unkind, so they would like aggression to be attributed to sensory modulation issues. Once in a while it is. If I look at their sensory checklist and I see he seeks proprioceptive input and he's over-responsive to auditory input, and I spend some time observing and I realize actually he only hits when somebody's being noisy close to him, or when somebody screams unexpectedly, then I think, yeah, actually, I think that could be sensory in his case. He's trying to get proprioceptive input from hitting to help override the obnoxious sound that this person just created. That makes sense. But the vast majority of the time, I end up thinking, yes, he has sensory needs, but the sensory needs are not driving the aggression, right? I'm less likely to see aggression as sensory nature than I am to see like self-injurious behaviors. I do think is more often sensory based because it's self-directed, where aggression is other-directed. So more often than not, I end up concluding aggression is more of a quote unquote behavior rather than a sensory issue. But I always want to start with asking myself, can I explain that behavior in light of what I know about his sensory issues? And if so, then yes, I have every reason to believe a sensory diet approach should be beneficial for that child. So we start with that knowledge, and then we go on to developing our intervention plan. And when we think about what a sensory diet actually is, I think of three primary ingredients. And those three ingredients are sensory breaks, which are a structured time for appropriate sensory input to occur. And those are what we think about, like 10 minutes every 2 hours for ages 10 and above. And we'll talk about some guidelines for other ages here in a minute. Sensory routines are when we build appropriate sensory input into a pre-existing problematic routine, usually the routine that incorporates the target behavior we're hoping to change. And then the third ingredient is sensory modifications and adaptations. And these are changes to the environment or the task that inherently assist with sensory processing. So those are the three ingredients that go into your sensory diet. Now, there may be times when you choose not to use all three ingredients, but I think it's almost always worth at least thinking through all three ingredients. And the reason I just go over this is because if you ask 5 OTs, what is a sensory diet, you might get 5 very different responses. And I just want to help us move toward best practice. And I feel like best practice will at least take the time to consider the role of all three of these things. Some of us use sensory diets just to refer to modifications and accommodations. Some of us use sensory diets just to refer to sensory breaks. But really, a diet is all three of those combined. Now, sometimes, like if I'm working with a little kid, like a 3-year-old, I usually don't incorporate sensory breaks into their sensory diet because I don't feel like kids should need breaks until they're academic, which is around kindergarten. But I definitely will incorporate sensory routines and modifications and adaptations into their sensory diet. Or there may be a high schooler I'm working with where if I just provide some modifications, he may not have to take time away from his classes for breaks or to do anything special for a routine. So there are definitely times when I don't use all three ingredients, but the vast majority of the time I do. Okay, now in the ideal world, treatment would be twofold. We would have a sensory diet in place, and we would also have direct intervention going on. And when we're talking about direct intervention, I'm mainly talking about that true clinically based sensory integration approach. And that's usually a one-on-one form of therapy where we're providing the just right challenge to the child to help raise and lower those thresholds accordingly so that he forms new connections in his brain and starts processing information in a more typical fashion. Now, if, when it was my child, I had her receiving both direct intervention, because in that clinically based SI approach, what we're thinking about is how do we change those thresholds for the long haul? I may not see a change tomorrow or next week or even next month, but 5 years from now, and I'm not saying it takes 5 years of uninterrupted therapy, but I'm thinking about the future, changing the neurology so that she processes information more typically. But I also wanted my daughter getting a sensory diet because I wanted her to do her best right now. I don't want her to have to wait for months and months of therapy to see significant change. I don't want her to miss out on what she's learning today in kindergarten, right? So ideally, it's great if both are in place. But the majority of you are school-based professionals, teachers and therapists, and the majority of the time, school-based professionals can implement the sensory diet approach. You're not often able to implement direct intervention or to even make sure it's happening outside of school, right? So I still have seen good changes, and I've even seen some changes in thresholds with the consistent application of a sensory diet. If you're a clinically based therapist, it's easier to provide that direct intervention. It's a little bit harder to make sure anybody follows through on the sensory diet, because I don't have interaction with the school professionals, and the parents may or may not follow through. So if I'm in the clinic, I'm focusing most of my time here, trying to get follow through here. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. So you may not be able to implement both of these things, but just know that's kind of like best practice. Ideally, they'd both be in place. Now, I will say for you school-based professionals, sometimes we feel a lot of pressure to provide like AIRS SI treatment in the schools, from really eager parents. And we feel the pressure to do that. And I get, this is an area that's challenging to explain to parents about why it can't happen in schools. But the number one reason is because research, well, first of all, we have to have the medically relevant versus educationally relevant debate. But what research is showing us, like from the Star Foundation, is that to see significant change, it requires an intensive intervention approach. And what they're really calling intensive is at least three treatment sessions a week that are 60 to 90 minutes in length for at least 10 weeks. we're not going to be able to justify that kind of time with a child in the school. It's not the least restrictive environment for the vast majority of kids to be pulled out 3 times a week, right? The least restrictive environment is in their classroom, and I can help them function their best right now in their classroom with a sensory diet without having to have that direct intervention in place. Would I like them to get it? Yes, but school is not the place for that because it's not the least restrictive environment for them. They can still learn with a sensory diet in place. Their thresholds may not change unless they're also getting direct intervention. I hope that makes sense. I'm just wanting you to understand the basic difference between the sensory diet approach and the clinical ARIS type of sensory integration approach. They work very beautifully together when you can make that happen. Okay? Okay, so now let's go into each of the 3 ingredients a little bit more in depth. When we talk about sensory breaks, remember these are different than brain breaks. These are less frequent, but higher intensity and longer duration. The goal of the sensory break is to reach the sensory threshold for the child, to reach the healthy threshold for the child. So by about age 10, we aim for 10 minutes about every 2 hours. We don't have enough research to give you a specific formula for younger kids. But I've come up with a loose formula that works for most. It's at least a starting point. And then you're watching to see, is it enough for that child? Is it too much for that child? But it's a starting point. And my starting point recommendation is 10 minutes every hour for kindergarten and first grade, 10 minutes every hour and a half for second, third, and fourth grade, and 10 minutes every 2 hours for fifth grade and beyond. And again, remember that we're really referring to developmental age rather than chronological age in making that determination. So 10 minutes every hour for kindergarten and first, 10 minutes every hour and a half for second, third, and fourth, and 10 minutes every 2 hours for fifth grade and beyond. Younger kids and kids with cognitive impairments will need it more frequently. Sensory seekers typically need longer breaks than over or under responders. For whatever reason, it takes longer to reach the threshold for a sensory craver. Now, as a team, you're just going to have to decide what's feasible. I usually start, as the OT, with my direct intervention time to figure out how long does it take to reach his threshold by engaging him in strategies that he could realistically engage in throughout his educational day, okay? If I can reach that threshold in 10 minutes with a platform swing, but he doesn't have access to a platform swing on a daily basis, that's not helpful. I need to be experimenting with strategies that he has access to on an ongoing basis, okay? So, I'm looking at my watch and I'm just watching to see when am I seeing those adaptive responses that I'm looking for. Now that's harder in kids you don't know very well. So if I'm working with a new student who's new to me, I may ask a paraprofessional or teacher to come with me those first couple times, and I'm saying, tell me when he looks his best. And I'm just looking for those subtle changes that makes me think he looks good right now. So if it takes, let's say 30 minutes to reach his threshold, where we're seeing some nice adaptive responses, then I recommend a 30-minute sensory break every 2 hours. And if it's a general ed teacher, she's probably going to look at me like I fell off Mars because that's not feasible, right? A general ed teacher can't devote time to allow a child to take a 30-minute sensory break because he's probably going to need supervision during that time too, and it's just not realistic. So what sometimes happens if we don't have good communication with your teachers is I may recommend something like a 20-minute sensory break. He really needs a 20-minute sensory break in the morning and then another 20-minute sensory break in the afternoon. So she's taken it all in. And she's thinking to herself, maybe we don't have a superb relationship, so she doesn't want to say it to me, but she's thinking, I can't give him 20, but I can probably do 10. So let's remember back to those thresholds, okay? Hang on, I think I can use a pen and draw it on the screen here. Okay, so let's say this little guy's threshold is this high, right? And I'm saying it's going to take him 20 minutes to get here. And he comes in, whoop, it's kind of hard to write. He's wound up. He's right here already. He's already running and jumping and spinning and crashing. And I'm saying 20-minute sensory break. And the teacher's thinking, no, I can't give him 20, but I can give him 10. Okay, so look where we are at 10 minutes. 10 minutes in, he's here. His sensory break is over. Is he better or worse? He's worse. He's going to look more disorganized after that sensory break than he did before. So it's on me as the therapist to be a really good communicator and say to the teacher, is 20 minutes feasible? And there may be some settings where it is. You know, if this child is in a self-contained classroom or has a one-on-one aide, it might be possible to give him a 20-minute sensory break. And then we have, 30 or 40 minutes where he's actually educable, so it's even justified. But in a general ed setting, anything more than about 10 is probably not going to be feasible. So we just have to have good conversations, make sure that the team understands, and then we make a decision together. If we decide it's not feasible, then we're going to go in a different direction, which I call Plan B, and I'll show you Plan B here in a little bit. So that's the importance of communication. Okay. So as far as when sensory breaks should happen, it's usually best not to make them time-based, especially in homes. Because if I say he needs this at 7 a.m., thinking that that's when he usually gets out of bed, but one day he sleeps until 9, then the parent's just kind of lost. Like, what do I do now? Do I go back and start with? So I usually don't recommend time-based sensory breaks for home. Sometimes at school, though, it is easiest to go ahead and build them into a routine. At home, I tend to do things more like right after waking up, right before lunchtime, right after nap time, right when he gets home from school, because those things will happen every day, even if the exact times differ. At school, it's usually best to go ahead and build it into the pre-existing routine, but it's up to me to determine when those sensory breaks are going to be most helpful for him. And it depends on the child's needs. Like, over-responders often need their sensory breaks to happen right after a very overstimulating event, like right after eating in the school cafeteria or right after PE, because that's when they're overstimulated. So they need their sensory breaks then. Under-responders tend to do better with having their breaks before a learning task, like 10-minute sensory break before we sit down and do math, 10-minute sensory break before we sit down and do English. So you have to think about, when are these sensory breaks going to be most effective for the kids? Now, obviously, when we're talking about this degree of customization, we're mainly thinking about kids who are spending the majority of their day in a supportive classroom or a resource room or self-contained room. When we're talking about gen ed kids, we're going to do more meeting their needs in a manner like implementing brain breaks and sensory breaks that everybody gets to participate in. And another thing for you general ed teachers is to think about your whole day schedule. You can usually count PE, recess, music, lunch. You can usually count those things as sensory breaks because they're moderate to higher intensity sensory experiences. And then you would just have to build in like a true sensory break if your schedule causes you to go longer than the 1 to 2 hours, depending on the age of your kids, without that moderate to higher intensity sensory experience. Okay? But ideally, in general ed, we're meeting the needs through classroom-based intervention rather than anything that singles that child out. Hang on, I can't progress to the next slide for some reason. Let me, oh, there I got my cursor back. Okay, so sensory breaks, in addition to the frequency, here's a couple of other things that are important to know about them. Sensory breaks need to be structured. They need to be based on the child's current sensory needs, and it's best if they're choice-based. The reason that this has come to light to me is I've seen how many classrooms have like a sensory area, or some schools even have a sensory room where kids are just kind of turned loose, and it's assumed, because it's a sensory room or sensory area, that the kids will by nature meet their own sensory needs, and that counts as a sensory break. But I'm here to tell you it doesn't work. The last district that I was actually employed by, it was a great district. We had a lot of money in our special ed department, and every building in the district had these phenomenal sensory rooms. But the group of therapists before had taught the teachers primarily. We had a really strong autism program in this district. People would move to our district for that program. So mainly the teachers of kids with autism were told they could take their kids to the sensory room, turn them loose a couple times a day, and that counted as their sensory break. The problem with that is that would work for kids who do not have a sensory modulation disorder, because most of us gravitate toward what we need. So if you have a typically developing kid from a sensory standpoint and they're needing to be calmed down at the moment, they probably will get in the cocoon swing and swing themselves in a linear fashion. If they need to be alerted, they might get on the sit and spin and wind themselves up. But our kids with sensory modulation disorders do not know what they need, and they have no idea how to go about meeting their needs. So that's where the structure comes in. We have to use tools to help them determine their current sensory speed and to help them determine the strategies that will actually be beneficial for them at the moment. If you have sensory rooms, what I like to do, or even a sensory area, or even in a classroom, is just designate like one corner is the calming corner, one corner is the alerting area, one corner is the just right area, and then hang a poster board of strategies that are helpful if you're needing calming or if you're needing alerting. So as the kids come into the room or the area, how many people's engines are going too fast right now? Okay, you guys go to the calming corner. How many people's engines are going too slow right now? All right, you guys go there. How many people think you're just right now? Okay, go stay just right by participating in those activities. And then you can guide and correct. Actually, I think you do better over there, but it's providing that structure to keep them on track with the activities that will actually be beneficial for them at the moment. If you just turn those kids loose who have a modulation disorder, often they'll just gravitate toward a piece of equipment simply because they know what to do with it, rather than with thinking through the impact on their sensory systems at all. Okay? Okay. Now, let's talk for a minute about routines. With our routines, the parents and the teachers put on the non-negotiables and then leave open spots before, in between, and after the must-dos for choice-based activities. We can control the choices, but we still want them to be choice-based because that helps from a behavioral standpoint. Here's an example of a visual routine that I created for a little boy with autism who had a very hard time going through the getting ready for bed routine. Now, there's not really one right way or one wrong way for how to design a visual routine. It depends on how many steps a child can follow, what makes sense to him. So I usually consult with the speech therapist on that decision. This child, we could have put his entire day's schedule on one routine, and he could have done that. He had great sequencing skills. But if the speech therapist said, no, this is too much for him, I could have made it into several different cards, like one for bath time, one for toothbrushing, one for actually getting in bed. But I didn't have to do that for this kid. So we put it all on one card, front and back. It's a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, front and back. And he continues down this little journey. Now, whenever I want two things to happen simultaneously, I put them side by side or top and bottom on other cards, you'll see, to show those things happen at the same time. So in this one, the parent puts on bath time, pajama time, toothbrush time, book time, and getting in bed. And then the rest is choice-based, but we're controlling the choices based on what we know they need at the moment. So while he's in the tub, he gets to choose from yellow or red arrow activities to help him keep it together while he's in the tub. The option he's chosen here are Chewy tools. Another option is like tub crayons. During toothbrushing, his mom can blow bubbles for him, which is visually mesmerizing, or he can choose to have this vibrating snake around his mouth. It's good to always end a visual schedule with something the kids are looking forward to. That can be hard to do on a getting ready for bed routine. as adults, we love getting in bed. Kids aren't so thrilled with the prospect. So I do often use visual tools at that time. I like lava lamps. I like those electronic aquariums where you see the fish swimming across because they're mesmerizing, they're comforting. It's still something to focus on until your eyes get drowsy. Sometimes I even recommend videos. Now, I'm definitely not a huge fan of using TV for kids or, hardly anybody actually watches TV anymore, but iPads and things like that with programming on them. But I do find they often help first thing in the morning and last thing at night. It just kind of can serve as that transition piece. Now, if you're using videos at bedtime, we obviously don't want them to be watching something that's super entertaining or novel because that will not be sleep inducing. I usually recommend choose 2 or 3 videos and they choose from the same 2 or 3 videos every single night. And actually the same video, the same episode, like if it's a TV show, the same episode, because then you're leaving it on just so they have something to like visually fixate on long enough to hold their body still and stay in bed. I really like the ones that have a lot of music. I like the Baby Einstein videos, things like that, that I think can be helpful for kids to help them unwind for kids who have a very challenging time. Now, it goes against research for the majority of the population. Most of that research shows that TV time causes a release of cortisol, which is a hormone that makes it difficult for you to fall asleep. But in a lot of the kids I've worked with who have big sleep issues, I think their cortisol level is already so high, we're not going to alter that with a calming natured video. So it's something to try in your more severe cases. I've had pretty good luck with it with some kids. Anyway, and no matter what, it's good to have something that they're kind of looking forward to for once they get in bed. Okay, we already went over this example, the little guy who didn't like language arts. This is a preschooler who had to transition away from the computer to circle time every day. My first advice was, let's make computer time, right before recess or something that he likes more, but we just couldn't alter the schedule. So this was his routine, and he loved computer time. He hated circle time. He has autism. Circle time is very overstimulating to him. He is very high functioning, is very verbal for a child with autism, but he's an extreme over responder too. And, that's a very interactive time. So he became overstimulated quickly. So for him, we set up this visual schedule and the teacher showed him, you're going to get 15 minutes on the computer. And then it will be time to get ready for circle. You can choose 2 strategies to get your brain and your body ready for circle time and 1 strategy to look forward to for after circle time. So they would set this up, and then he would sit down at the computer with a visual timer. When the timer went off, all done, it's time to get ready. And he would use the strategies that he chose to prepare his brain and his body. He mainly needed calming strategies, so they were red or yellow arrow options. Went to circle time, and then something to get it back together again before he went back to work. Now, it's interesting. You see a variety of responses. Sometimes when you implement a program like this, it seems like instant, significant change. Like, wow, we cured him, yay. And then a few days later, the teachers will be like, it worked for a few days, but it is not working anymore. We call that the honeymoon effect. We see that a lot with little kids. It's actually not that the strategy stopped working. It's rather that they're wondering if their old strategies still work. Will the fit still work? Will the meltdown still work? And we need to be ready and prepared to answer no. We get more into that in my other course called Sensory and Behavior. But with this kid, Sam, we didn't get a honeymoon. He went from having major meltdowns during this transition to slightly smaller meltdowns during this transition, but we persisted, repetition, repetition, repetition. By a couple weeks later, they were significantly less meltdowns during this transition. So it could go either way. You could see a honeymoon effect where right away it's awesome and then it's not so awesome, or you could see kind of this gradual uphill. And with him, we got the gradual, but it still was working. Okay, then our third ingredient is modifications and adaptations. And on this first page, we're seeing modifications and adaptations that are really helpful for all kids with sensory modulation disorder. Things like in the home, I often recommend to just put the mattress directly on the floor rather than a bed frame, because then that becomes a relatively safe surface for jumping, rolling, crashing. Ban chairs and couches. Even with my own kids, I did this where you can watch TV, but you can't sit on a couch or a chair. They had a certain amount of TV time each day. And in the basement, we had therapy balls and billabos and beanbag chairs, because my thought was at least they're using their body. At least they're getting more sensory input than when they're just vegging out on the couch. So that can just be a kind of fun way to make sure they get more input. Organization is huge, particularly for our over responders. They just kind of feel like life happens to them and they're overwhelmed by it. And the more external organization we can bring to the table, the better off they are. So, maybe a different colored bin for every set of toys, and then we pick up one set before we get anything else out, things like that. Limiting and rotating toys available is necessary in many of the homes that I go into, where, it just looks like a toy store exploded. And really, kids just don't need many toys. In fact, a lot of research has shown they develop better imagination and better sustained attention in the presence of less toys. There's an Amish community not far from me, and I did some early intervention there for a while, and I was just shocked and amazed at the creativity of those kids. They were using wooden spoons instead of Barbie dolls, and it was neat to see, and it just really made me a believer. So I just really try to talk to parents about box everything up if you can't get rid of it. Sell what you can sell, donate what you can donate, but the things that you want them to have, get a big bin. Each week you get out a big bin. These are the toys for this week. The others are going in the basement, and it causes them to learn to have sustained attention to one toy rather than flitting from here to here all of the time. That can be very helpful for our kids with sensory processing issues. Obviously, if they have, a lovey or a favorite teddy bear or something, I wouldn't put that into the rotation, but just the play toys, I would do that with. Aroma is helpful for most of us as well. Aroma is a very individual thing. You can find some general recommendations, like in general, citrusy smells are alerting and earthy smells are calming, like pine. But it's very much a preferential thing. So I usually just make a variety of scents available and let the child choose. In general, if you like it, it's modulating for you from an aroma standpoint. If you don't like it, it's not modulating. So a couple ways that you can incorporate aroma. We habituate to smell very, very quickly. So it's not super helpful to put it on your skin or put it in a diffuser, because we just habituate to it really, really quickly. But I like to use essential oils on like those friendship bracelets. Just a braided like 3-string bracelet works, or a paracord bracelet that boys will even wear that you can get at like Five Below in the dollar store. And just put a couple drops of an oil on there. And that way they can bring it to their nose to smell it when they need it, but they won't really habituate to it because they only smell it when it's here. And that can be helpful for some kids. I had one kid who he felt like vomiting. He didn't very often, but as he approached the school cafeteria each day, he felt like vomiting. So by doing that, if the smell was obnoxious to him, he had an alternative, on his bracelet, and that helped to suppress that instinct to vomit. Okay, at school, preferential seating is good for almost all of our kids with any of the 3 subtypes of modulation disorder, because if I'm over responsive, but I'm front and center to the teacher, it helps me disregard everything out here. Or if I'm under responsive and I'm front and center, it helps her be a little bit more in my face, So either way, that tends to be helpful. Classical music or metronomes tends to be good for the majority. 60 beats per minute is a good generic place to start, and then see if you need to make it a little faster, a little slower for a metronome. And there are apps. There's a metronome app. There are several actually that are free, and you can adjust the speed, and that could be playing on a child's desk or somewhere in the classroom. Scented pencils or markers are, again, good for most. Aroma tends to be something that can be beneficial for most of us. Now this page shows modifications that are especially helpful for over responders, like white noise, calming music. The metronome can be calming, it can be just right, it can be either. Noise reduction headphones, pressure garments or weighted garments. Choices, choices, choices. These kids feel very out of control. And by giving them choices, we're giving them more of a feeling of control. So we're putting that back to them. Weighted neck wraps and lap pads are helpful for most too. These are easy to make, actually. I often just fill them with rice. For lap pads, I usually go for about 4 pounds. For neck wraps, kind of depends on the size and the muscle tone of the child. Anywhere from 1 to 2 pounds often is a good amount. Sometimes you can go heavier. Visual tools like sunglasses to prevent reflection and glare, baseball visor, slant boards, which bring the pertinent information front and center. Those often help over responders disregard things in the peripheral a little bit better. I just want to say, when you're trying to decide between weighted garments and compression garments, weight is a little bit more of an intensive form of input, but I stay away from weighted garments for kids with low muscle tone because they're already having trouble fighting gravity, and putting more weight on them probably isn't going to be helpful. So for kids with low muscle tone, I go toward pressure garments instead. If kids have normal muscle tone, you can take your pick, but weight is usually going to have a little bit more intensity in its favor, weighted garments. The benefit to compression garments, though, is that you can leave it on all day. So if kids are self-conscious, you could have them put it on under their clothing and they could leave it on all day. We've looked at habituation with weighted garments and compression garments, and we can't really show that it's happening. And the feeling is it's because we continue to breathe against and move against the garments. So we used to recommend, like 30 minutes on, 30 minutes off or something like that. But we don't really think habituation is actually happening in response to this garments. At least we can't see research showing that it's happening. So we're less worried about it from habituation standpoint. Now we're just more thinking about what are we doing to body dynamics and ergonomics. And pressure garments shouldn't impact ergonomics, but weight might. And so we don't want to impose weight on a young developing body for unlimited amounts of time. So with weighted garments, I still recommend wearing schedules, usually anywhere from 20 to 50 minutes on, and then at least that long off before putting it on again. But though that's just going to have to be your clinical judgment based on what you know about that child's lifestyle and all of that. I typically stick more to like 30 minutes, but if they're going to go to social studies and it's a 50-minute class, I might say just have them wear it the whole time because it's easier. And since we're not worried about habituation, it probably isn't that big of a deal. Okay, here are some recommended modifications for under responders. Little desktop fans kind of keep you on. Anything cold. I often use those little ice packs that go in lunch boxes to put on the back of a forearm or the back of the neck to just kind of keep kids alert. Frozen foods are a good snack that's alerting. Cold water splash on your face or your hands can get you going again too. Under responders do well with timers because they need that kind of push, that race the clock impact. There's some good ones. They're most available in app form now. This one is the old-fashioned time timer, and it's available in app form now as well. This is called the Fun Timer app. I like this one. You can take a picture of something the kid wants to do. And so, if I'm the mom, I might say, okay, if you stay on track with your morning routine, you'll have 15 minutes to play with your toy cars before we have to get in the car to head to school. Now, if he gets off track, like he starts having a fit or he starts being uncooperative during the morning routine, I can hit the stop button and he sees that his fun time is disappearing. When he gets back on track and starts complying, I hit start and he can preserve the rest of his fun time. So it's a way of making him own the fact that you're wasting your own fun time by not helping me with this routine. So that can be a good way to incentivize your under responders. And then fast intermittent touch can be helpful for these kids too. Okay, let's see, what time is it? It's 2:19. This would be a good time for a 15-minute break for those of you here live. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording for a minute. Okay, back from the break, and we now, let's see, did I turn on? Yep. Okay. So we're going to start looking at a few forms that can be helpful for you. Actually, we're going to look at one form, but it's in 3 parts. The sensory needs assessment summary. And we're going to talk about target behaviors and data tracking and how to form your intervention plan within this form. So if you can pull out the sensory needs assessment summary and plan that was included with your course materials, I want us to go over that together now. This is what it looks like. And I just like forms. They help me structure my thoughts, and I like creating forms. And so you're free to use this one, no copyright attached. You can make copies of the one you have, and you can always print from the website as well under that free forms. Actually, this one I think is under forms for members. So you just have to be logged in, but you'll be able to print it out whenever you would like to, and if you feel that it helps you. And so let's just go over how we would use this set of forms real quick. The student's basic information at the top, and then I would summarize the standardized assessment results if there were any. Like I might say, on the sensory profile, he scored in the definite difference. His scores indicated definite differences in the following areas, something like that. Or if you didn't do any standardized testing, I would just write an A. In the second box, I'm putting an O or a U next to each sensory system to indicate whether the results showed me over or under responsiveness. And some of them, I'm just going to leave them blank. Like if there were only 1 or 2 random check marks here or there, then I'll just leave it blank because I don't think that necessarily indicates either under or over responsiveness. This becomes an easy reference for me later, where when I'm thinking through the target behaviors, I can look at this box and think, does his pattern of responsiveness help me to explain the target behavior that we're hoping to change? So it's a good, easy reference for you. And then in the third box, I'll summarize the effect of the child's environment in regard to his or her sensory modulation ability. So I may write that she's doing really well in the resource room, but she falls apart in general ed, And then I could look up above and think, well, that makes sense that she falls apart in general ed because she's over responsive to auditory and visual input. And the general ed classroom has more of both. So I want to make notes there, or I may say, the parents state that she did really well in 2nd grade where there was a small teacher to student ratio. Whatever comes up, this is a good place to put that. And then the bottom box is where we're going to select our target behaviors and list them here. And this is usually kind of how I bond with the teacher, The therapist-teacher relationship can be a beautiful thing, as we all know, and it can sometimes be problematic because, as therapists, we are asking teachers, we're putting more on their plates, We're not going to be the ones implementing, but we're saying, I need you to do this and this and this. So we need to just be sensitive to that. And one way that I have found to be helpful is rather than me going in with my own agenda, I don't really, even if the Peabody shows me that she has really poor fine motor skills, that may not be what's making it the most challenging for the teacher to educate her. So if I go in with an agenda, with my agenda, not knowing how the child really is functioning in class, and I'm asking the teacher to spend time teaching the special handwriting program, et cetera, it can be frustrating for both of us. So I just always start the conversation with, what are your biggest concerns about these kids and how can I help? And when we're talking about one specific child who obviously has lots of issues, we may be seeing delayed motor skills and behavioral issues and sensory issues, then I say to the teacher, what are the top 2 or 3 areas that you would like some help with? And if at all possible, those are the areas that I want to turn into our target behaviors, and those are the ones that I will help support. And that helps us get on the same page. Because if I'm working on things that she knows will be beneficial for that child's education, then then it feels like I'm helping more than I'm creating this higher level of expectations for her job assignment, right? Which is frustrating for sure. So I'm usually not the one I'm not the one deciding the target behaviors. I usually want the teacher to decide those, or the parent if you're working in a home environment. So they pick 2 or 3 things that are the most problematic at the moment. And then on the second page, this page helps me think a little bit deeper about the target behaviors that we're trying to change. So let's just use the example of a little guy I'm remembering who was mostly in a life skills program, and he went into general ed 2nd grade for social studies and science. And he was doing okay in the life skills room, but the general ed teacher says, he just kind of drives me crazy. He won't stay seated. He's constantly just up and down and all over the place, and he's distracting to the other kids. And so I started out by looking back at his sensory assessment that was already completed. And I saw that he is over responsive to auditory and visual input, and he actively seeks proprioceptive and vestibular input. So does it make sense that this child going into a much busier room, he went from a small class size to this large class size in general ed, and it's science and social studies. So a lot of the science is hands-on, group-based, lots going on. Does it make sense that this child who's over-responsive to visual and auditory input is going to struggle more? Yes. Since he seeks proprioceptive and vestibular input, does it make sense that he's going to move to try to help himself cope with that which is driving him crazy? It makes sense. Yes, it does. So now we're just going to think about which of those issues are most impacting him. Based on assessment results, which sensory systems are most likely impacting this behavior? And we're going to decide auditory over-responsiveness and vestibular seeking for him, okay? If the behavior indicates the student is seeking input, which he is seeking movement or vestibular input, rate the intensity of the sensory feedback provided by the behavior on a scale of 1 to 10. This is subjective for sure. You just have to decide for yourself. But I just always think about it in my own body. So if I am sitting flat in my seat with both butt cheeks on the chair, that I'm not getting a lot of sensory feedback from that. It's probably like a 1 on an intensity scale. If I'm near my chair, but I'm just constantly getting up and down, sitting on one leg, throwing myself backwards and forwards, but I'm still in the vicinity of my chair, I would say that's probably like a 3 or a 4 on the intensity scale versus having my behind flat in my seat, right? So that's good to know, because then I can select an intervention strategy that's a 3 or a 4 on the intensity scale, and therefore equal to the intensity of the behavior that I'm trying to replace, right? And in this case, I might recommend like a core wobble chair or a T-stool, because I feel like that's probably a 3 or a 4 on the intensity scale. So as long as I match the intensity, then I have every reason to expect that strategy to work. And then we go on, but I might also remember that he's over-responsive to auditory and seeking vestibular. So I also want to think about, how can I address the auditory over-responsiveness? I'm going to probably think first about noise reduction headphones or white noise playing near his desk, something like that. And then the third question is, in what setting, environment, or time of day is the behavior typically displayed or displayed the most frequently? For this child, it's in general education. He's in that classroom from 9 to 10 a.m. every day. So do I need to put the core wobble chair in his other classroom? Probably not. He's doing fine in there. So this is what leads us back to that conversation about least restrictive environment. If he's doing okay in his life skills room while in a regular chair, just like the other kids in that classroom, then that is the least restrictive environment for him. But in general ed, if he needs a core wobble chair in order to remain seated, then the core wobble chair becomes the least restrictive environment for him, right? So the other benefit of only intervening in the setting where he's struggling is that it will remain more novel for him. You know, if he only has the core wobble chair when he goes into general ed, it's going to be a little bit more intense for his body because he hasn't already gotten used to that in his other classroom. So we want to think about intervening where the behavior is the most problematic for the most part. So that one was kind of easy because it's kind of a low intensity behavior. This is harder with your high intensity behaviors. Like, let's think about a little wrist biter. Let's say he's biting his wrist so hard that the skin is breaking often. So based on assessment results, which sensory symptoms are most likely impacting this behavior? We aren't looking at any one particular child here, so we don't have assessment results, but we know that he's getting oral proprioceptive input and proprioceptive input to his wrist through that intense biting. He's agitated. Let's just keep making this up. He looks agitated while he's biting his wrist. Therefore, we know there's something that he's over-responsive to as well. In addition to seeking this, there's something that's driving him crazy, and that's why he looks upset. So I'm going to use adaptations and modifications to try to reduce whatever's driving him crazy. And then in the next question, rate the intensity of the sensory feedback provided by the behavior of wrist biting on a scale of 1 to 10. And if he's breaking the skin by how hard he's biting, that's probably an 8 or a 9 on the intensity scale. Unfortunately, I don't have very many tools in my tool belt that are equal to a 9 or a 10 on the intensity scale. So this goes back to needing more of a holistic intervention approach, where I'm going to provide him strategies that are as intense as possible, maybe an oral vibrator that he can bite really hard on, maybe play an oral tug of war with him a few times a day, things like that to try to get as close to an 8 or a 9 as I can. And then I may need to use incentives like rewards and consequences to help motivate him to tolerate the lower intensity strategy instead of the higher intensity strategy, which is what he's actually seeking. Another thing that I often do is think about combining multiple strategies to get as close to an 8 or a 9 as I can. Like maybe that's not as good if he's agitated, but let's just think about, well, I have an example of a girl. She was a 3rd grader, and whenever she went into general ed, she went into general ed for math because she was bright. Other than that, she was in a self-contained classroom, but she was doing really well in math. So she started going to general ed for math. But whenever she was seated in a traditional desk, she was masturbating. And that's not a great behavior in a general ed 3rd grade classroom because the other kids were wondering and it's distracting. And so that's like a 9 or a 10 on the intensity scale. So we use several strategies to add up to a 9 or a 10. We had her sit on a therapy ball instead of a regular chair. We had this weighted dolphin that we kept in the freezer, and whenever she went into general ed, she left this on her lap like a weighted lap pad. The cold was inhibitory, plus or intense, I guess I should say. Plus that weight just kind of kept her rooted, gave her some more input, sort of inhibited access a little bit. And then we also kept fidgets on a Dyson on her desk. And the teacher's reminder was just hands above your desk, hands above your desk. And by having some fidgets up there, she was more likely to keep her hands above the desk that way too. So we used a combination of strategies to make it as intense as we could to try to match the intensity of the behavior we're trying to replace. That's the only way you'll see success, is to get as close to the intensity that you're trying to match as possible. If you can't get very close, you're probably going to need to use rewards and consequences to make up the difference, okay? And then the 3rd question says, in what setting, environment, or time of day is the behavior typically displayed or displayed the most frequently? For this girl, it was whenever she sat in a regular chair. Now, the general ed teacher was very willing to use these strategies because she really wanted the girl in her classroom and she wanted her to be successful. But it also happened in the regular chair in her classroom for kids with autism too. But that teacher was not willing. She was very much from an ABA background and felt like that sensory strategies were giving in to their behaviors in a way. Not all ABA therapists feel that way for sure, but I've found that some of the more old school ones kind of do, who received their training a while back. It seems like more often than not. There are some newer ones who also feel that way, but not as prevalent as it used to be. But she did not use sensory strategies, didn't believe in it. So in that classroom, she tended to handle more behaviorally, and it wasn't very successful. But ideally, I would have liked those strategies pleasant in both environments, since it happened in both. Okay, so that's that second page. The third page is where we really begin writing out our plan. And here I would recommend the frequency of sensory breaks. Like I might recommend for a first grader, 10 minutes every hour. Every hour. And then I would like them to be 10 to 15 minutes in length. And during those sensory breaks, she needs alerting activities, right? So this can become like a one-page summary to give to everyone on the team. So we're all on the same page with what we're talking about when we refer to this child's sensory diet. In the sensory routines box, notice there's one box for each of the 3 major ingredients for the sensory diet. And then the sensory routines box, often I'm just either sketching out how I want the visual sensory routine to be set up, or I may even go ahead and set it up and photocopy and just staple it to the back of the sheet. But depending on how I'm setting it up, I may show which ones are choice-based and which ones represent the must-dos. But that way we're all on the same page with how to use that sensory routine. And then in the third box, I'm usually just making a bullet list of recommended modifications and adaptations that I think would be helpful for this child. Now, I say I. In reality, as much as possible, I want this to be a collaborative event. So if I'm a school-based therapist, I'd like to sit down with at least a teacher, if not the whole team, talk about what we've learned through sensory assessment and observations, and my general recommendations, because I'm usually the one who's most in the know regarding the sensory aspect. But I want to collaborate on when should the breaks happen, how long can we make the breaks, when do we need certain routines to take place, and what adaptations have worked. So as much as possible, we want this to be collaborative. So this is usually the page that I give to the whole team. So we all have that reference in front of us when we're talking about implementation. Okay, for you live attendees, if you have any questions about that form, feel free to use the box, the chat box, to let me know. Okay, with data tracking, I always say any data is better than no data. So don't get too overwhelmed. In general, I often find it helpful to aim for 3 consecutive days of data tracking, but they don't have to be very long. In fact, often I'm doing 15 minutes per day for 3 consecutive days. Now, to eliminate as many variables as possible, it's ideal if it's the same 15 minutes each day. So, for example, the little boy who wouldn't stay seated during science in general ed, that started at 9 a.m. So I went in from 9 to 9:15, 3 consecutive days, and I'm taking data, averaging the results. The 3 consecutive days helps to make sure that you're not just happening to see a particularly good day or a particularly bad day. And 15 minutes is pretty doable. You don't have to take data all day, but just during that time period where it's most problematic. So a couple other things about data. We want to be very specific with our data tracking. It's best if it's the same data tracker who's tracking the before and the after. So if I'm the data tracker, I'm do 3 consecutive days, average the results. Then I implement the sensory program, make sure it's going well. And then usually a month later, I do 3 consecutive days of data again, average the results, and then I can compare post-intervention data to pre-intervention data and show we are showing a 20% improvement in in-seat behavior, something like that, okay? If I am the data tracker, it's easiest because I can define for myself what I need. If you're not able to take data for 3 consecutive days because you're an itinerant therapist who's in 50 different buildings, you may need to either have somebody else track the data, like a paraprofessional, or maybe you're just going to have to be okay with 1 day of data. But if you're teaching somebody else to take the data, we need to carefully define what are we looking for and then be consistent with that. So for example, with the little boy that wouldn't be in the seat, we just first have to define what are we calling in-seat behavior. And we decided It's when both of his butt cheeks are in the seat. If even one comes off, we're going to count that as out of seat behavior because he's just constantly, moving like that. So once we have that defined as both booty cheeks in the seat, then I can go in from 9 to 9:15 with my stopwatch. And at any time when he moves out of the in-seat position, then I am pressing my stopwatch. When he returns both cheeks, then I can release it. At the end of the 15 minutes, I can show he was in his seat 9 of the 15 minutes, right? So as long as we're carefully defining what we're looking at, then we should be able to have another data tracker track the data, but it's still best to have the same person do it each day. So if it can't be you both times, it's probably better not to be you either time, right? For consistency. There's a number of different ways to track data. The two ways that we have, the two forms that are available from my site, once you're logged in under the Forms for Members tab, would be tracking frequency of behaviors, which is helpful for things like wrist biting. So if I'm tracking from 9 to 9:15, I'm just going to make a tally mark every time he bites his wrist, every new bite, right? That's frequency of behaviors. The other one that's available from the website is duration of, or time as a percentage. I'm sorry. So like for the little boy staying in his seat, if he was in a seat for 9 of the 15 minutes, I could say, what would that be? That would probably be like 65% of the time, something like that. So those are two good ways for tracking sensory-based behaviors. But if you are in a school that tracks data for kids with autism, you probably have access to a wide variety of data tracking methods already. If you're looking for something specific, feel free to email me because I have a variety of forms available also and intend to get more online when our new website is up. And then the intervention plan we already talked about. Okay, let me just go back to data for a minute to say, data is what is super helpful because we don't have lots of research supporting this form of intervention yet. And we don't have enough to know for sure which child it's going to work for and which child it's not going to work for. It's amazing to me. This approach was huge for my daughter, but I see other kids and I think they have that same set of symptoms, but they don't respond anything like she did. It doesn't seem that helpful for them. And I've seen many other kids who respond like my daughter also, but even as experienced as I am, and I've been doing this 20 some years, I can't make that determination when I start seeing a kid. I can't look at them. They all look fairly similar on the profile or on the checklist. And I just know from experience, some of them are going to respond well to this form of intervention and others aren't. And I cannot pick them yet by looking. I just have to give it a go. And then I can make that determination. And so, sometimes you kind of get that kickback. Is it research-based? And I'll say, yes, it's getting there. We don't have a ton, but we have some. But what I will do for you is take data. And if I can't show that we're making significant difference in a month to 2 months, I will not ask you to continue using these strategies. It's taken me a while in each of my new locations just to build that trust with the staff, that they know that that's true. I'm not at all hesitant to say, for whatever reason, the sensory approach isn't working for this kid, so let's spend our time and energy elsewhere. And we may need to think more about our behavioral intervention plan or, something else. So data is what helps me make those decisions. It's also helpful, like if you have a parent who's really pushing for more and more and more from a sensory standpoint, he needs sensory breaks every hour. And if your data shows he actually doesn't do any better after a sensory break than he did before, then there's your justification for discontinuing the sensory breaks. So it's helpful at many levels. If I can show through data it's working for this particular child, then it doesn't really matter if I don't have a wealth of research to back me up, right? So I just think for now, at our point in time with where we're at, with not having super sensitive diagnostic tools to help us know which kids will respond and all of that, I think data is really, really important for us in making these determinations. Okay, now there are going to be times when you think, I'm doing everything right, and it's not working. So I just want to take a little bit of time to talk about what may be going on if that's the case. You did your sensory assessment. You feel pretty darn sure that this is a sensory issue, but it's just not helping. And I'm going to use a couple case studies to show you what the problem may be. It's usually with your sensory cravers or your some form of under responsiveness that you struggle the most. With over responders, it's typically a little easier to help them. There's more we can do with modifications and adaptations. Calming strategies have a more instant response. So for those reasons, it's less of a problem with our over responders that we feel like we're not going in the right direction, more of a problem with our under responders. So let me tell you about these two boys, very different boys, but both on the under responsive end. Stephen is a little guy who was 4, and he was in a preschool classroom for kids with autism at this time. And he did all of these really intense stimming behaviors, little fast and furious Tasmanian devil type of kid, never stopped moving, 120 miles an hour all day. It wasn't all day. It was actually a 2.5-hour preschool program, but nonetheless, never stopped moving. So he had this awesome, amazing teacher, and she said, not too long into the school year, I do not feel like I'm educating this kid at all. I just can't get to him. He just cannot stop stimming and moving long enough to learn. So, I could glance at him 2 seconds and see that he's an incredible sensory craver. Whether it can be treated from a sensory approach or not depends on whether he has a threshold that can be reached in a reasonable amount of time, right? Or whether he has a threshold at all. And so we implemented a sensory diet with really intense sensory experiences in the classroom. The teacher followed through beautifully. It wasn't helping at all. So I'm thinking it's a threshold issue. And one morning I had some cancellations. I worked in this very ideal setting anyway, where I had a lot of time to do best practice. And so I said to his teacher, it was a Monday morning, I'm going to take him down to the sensory lab. This was that district where we had sensory labs in every building. I said, I'm going to take him down there, and we might not be back until it's time to go. I'm going to keep him there either until I reach his threshold or until it's time for him to be picked up by his mom. So I had about 2.5 hours to play with, because I got him as soon as he got to school that morning. And I thought, I'm just going to see if there's a threshold, because that tells me whether it's sensory or not. And took him down to the sensory lab, and he loved intensity. So we had, by the way, this room was specially designed with special flooring, crash pads mounted on the wall, the whole 9 yards. So it was about as safe as it could be. So he got on the platform swing and on his belly, and I was hoping he would reach out his hands to push off the wall with his arms. It was a padded wall, and I was wanting him to use all of his muscles and joints while swinging. That's pretty intense. But he wasn't doing that. He's very coordinated, so it was definitely a choice. But he was choosing to crash into the padded wall with his head each time. So I don't recommend that for everybody. But because he had good muscle tone, because he was very coordinated, and I knew this was a choice, and because of the padded wall, I just kept his spine in line, and I kept it reasonable. But he wanted that to go on for a while. And that's deep proprioceptive input throughout his entire central nervous system. So I let it go on for a while. A while later, he started standing up on the platform swing. So I pulled the Cloud 9 crash pad over, and I showed him jump in the Cloud 9. But he didn't jump. He dove head and shoulders first into the Cloud 9. Again, not safe for most kids. But in this special setting with this particular strong, good muscle tone kid, I felt okay about it. So I thought, I'm just going to allow it. So he was choosing to dive off the platform swing into this Cloud 9 and land on his head most often, and kind of head and shoulder like that. And that's super intense. And he'd get back on the swing, and we'd swing, and then he'd do it again. So this is really intense play. And about 45 minutes into this intense play, he landed in, no, I'm sorry, let me back up. About 45 minutes in, I started to think, I think I'm getting somewhere. What I was seeing is this boy who usually had really rigid muscle tone because he was really wound up, he started to look more relaxed and more normal muscle tone. He typically had this high-pitched giggle that wasn't appropriate to the situation. Like, he would just giggle. He was off in his own world, and it had nothing to do with what was happening in reality. But now it's seeming pretty appropriate. It's more like a normal little boy sound of a giggle, first of all. And second, it was like right after he crashed, or right after I reacted, like I'd say, oh boy, and he'd giggle, you know? So I thought that's an adaptive response. Muscle tone is one adaptive response. Appropriate laughter is another adaptive response. Not too long later, I started realizing he's actually acknowledging that I exist. You know, that was new. He never really acknowledged you existed. Never looked at you. Never mowed or planned around you. Like, you know, he'd walk and you got out of his way. And all of a sudden, I'm seeing he's making a point of walking around me. He's even looking at me to see my response. Sometimes, you know, that's a big adaptive response. So I'm thinking we're getting somewhere. A few minutes later, satiation. That's super exciting because that's, you know, it's not even a question whether you're seeing an adaptive response at that point, where he dove off the cloud nine and he just kind of laid there. This kid who never holds still, held still. And I thought, I'm really getting somewhere. But this is 50 or 55 minutes into really intense activities. So that's a pretty darn high threshold, you know? But anyway, he just laid there. So now I'm wanting the next higher level of adaptive response, which would be interaction. So I pounded the big red beanbag on top of him. He was in the cloud nine, and I squished him and I lifted it up, and I could tell he wanted me to do it again, but he didn't have any method of communication. So I started helping him approximate more, and he did. And I would do it again, and I'd pick it up, and he'd bring his hands together, and I'd say, you want more? And I'd do it again. And the speech therapist's office was in there too, and she got all excited and came out and started working with us. And we kept the momentum going. And about 30 minutes later, she had him verbally approximating more. And it was so exciting because it was his first attempt at functional communication ever, you know? But it took an hour and a half to get there of really intense play, the type of play that we could not have happen in the classroom. So what's going on with him? Is it sensory? It is, because there is a threshold. Are we reasonably going to be able to reach that threshold within his classroom? No. Now, even though I have a really good working environment and I had a really reasonable caseload, still, I'm not going to be able to justify having this kid an hour and a half a day. I'm sorry, I was trying to write something. Here we go. Let's try that again. Why is it not working? Pen. I don't know why. No, it's still not working. Sorry. Anyway, I was just going to show you what the threshold was doing there. But for some reason, it's just not letting me. Nope. Okay. So anyway, I'll just try to describe it. He has a threshold, but it's really, really high. So I'm not going to be able to justify taking him an hour and a half every day from his 2.5-hour preschool program. That is just not going to fly, even in the most ideal setting. So when we think about Plan A, for kids who are sensory cravers, Plan A is to try to stimulate to the threshold. The threshold's really high. We're going to use stimulating activities to try to get them to that threshold where that neurochemical release takes place. That's Plan A. We decided we're going to make Plan A happen on Mondays. Mondays were usually the most difficult time for him anyway. So I took him for the first 45 minutes upon his arrival to school and got to that threshold where I started to see adaptive responses. And then the speech therapist took him for the next 45 minutes, and she kept the momentum going while working on functional communication. Whatever she learned with him on Mondays, he could take back to the classroom and he'd use in the classroom. Like once he learned to say more, he'd start using more in the classroom. But it's just like he couldn't learn anything else until the next Monday, which was kind of frustrating. But nonetheless, that was helpful, and Mondays were good. Now, on Tuesday through Friday, we're not going to be able to reach his threshold. It can't happen in the classroom, and 45 minutes is too long to remove him from that classroom every single day. You know, honestly, I could probably make a case that if that's the only way he's educable, we should do it, but that's not going to fly with too many school districts. So I wasn't winning that argument there. So what are we going to do on Tuesday through Friday? Plan A is out. We're not going to be able to reach his threshold in the classroom. So what I do, and this does not have research to back it up, just experience. If I figure out Plan A isn't feasible because of how long it takes, I go with what I call Plan B instead. It's not awesome. It's a Band-Aid rather than a fix, but it seems to be better than doing nothing at all. So on Tuesday through Friday, we implemented, or the teacher really implemented, a lot of calming strategies instead. She turned off the fluorescent lights, kept natural lighting on, or full spectrum lighting on. She, used a soft voice. We always had weight on him. He liked that halo head weight, weighted vest, ankle weights, not always at the same time, but we usually had one kind of weight on him or another. He was a strong kid who could handle it, and it did seem to slow him down a little bit. Lots of deep pressure through joint compressions and so forth, peaceful music playing in the classroom. So it's not awesome. It's a Band-Aid, but it was better than doing nothing at all. And I call that plan B. If we recognize we are not going to be able to do plan A within a feasible amount of time, then we go with plan B instead. Okay? So that's one thing to consider. Now let me tell you about Yusuf. Yusuf went to the same school. He was from Iraq, and he had a very low IQ, but no other diagnosis. And there either wasn't a system for educating him in Iraq, or it wasn't up to his parents' standard. I'm not sure. But the mom moved to the States with him, and the dad and the other siblings stayed in Iraq. So, they were here just so he could get educated. And we felt like we weren't educating him either. He was a passive under-responder. Cute little guy. He could walk. He'd walk in, just kind of plop down. He would just space out, and he was just gone, la la land. We couldn't get him to engage in anything. He was very hard to get to attend. He was just kind of lost in la la land. There was the language difference too, but it wasn't just that. So when I did his assessment for OT, he failed the Peabody with flying colors because I couldn't even get him to attempt to stack the blocks. But we went out into the hall to do some of the more gross motor types of things, catching the ball, things like that. And I started thinking he looks better out here. He's better when he's moving. He's better when he's using his body. So clearly he's a passive under-responder, and movement powers his brain. So, initially we started out with recommending activities like these. This was a life skills classroom. So green arrow strategies that he could engage in, and they had an area of the room dedicated to these types of activities. And, 10 or 15 minutes, he looked pretty good. So this was his sensory break. And then he looked good. So it made me think that we've reached a threshold that buys us a window of opportunity where he's going to be able to engage. But it just didn't happen. He looked good. He's engaged. We're together, on something. But then he'd go sit down, and he'd slouch back, and his eyes would glaze over. And he was just no longer on planet Earth with us. And it was almost instantaneous. I just started to wonder if it's like he has a little light switch in his brain. And when he's moving, the switch is on. But when he stops moving, the switch goes off. So I'm thinking, okay, we must need to keep him moving then. So we still used activities like these to get him up, to get his little engine going. But then we used activities like these to keep the momentum going. The teacher would choose the learning objective, like his were very basic, like color sorting. And so if she chose color sorting, she would say, choose one of these, and he would choose one. And if he chose crawling, he may have to crawl to this side of the tunnel to get the green blocks and crawl back to put them in the green bucket. Go back for red, crawl back and put them in the red bucket, and so forth. Or if he chose the rice table, we might bury the blocks in the rice table. And I still want to try to get multi-dimensional movement going on, head position changing. So if he found a green block, we might have him reach up and put that one in a bucket on the shelf. If he found blue, it might go in a bucket on the floor behind him. Red is going to go over here. So we're still getting head movement, etc., to keep his little engine on. And it worked. And we were excited to see how quickly we were writing new goals, because he was achieving them as long as we were keeping that little brain light switch on through movement. Okay, so those are some things to think through. If you think, I feel like it is sensory, but we're just not quite getting there, it's probably a threshold issue, and we either need to think about how to get more intense or how to keep the momentum going, okay? Also, another thing about Yusuf is, even though he was probably about 7 at that time, developmentally, he was much more like a toddler or early preschooler. And think about what toddlers and preschoolers do. We don't ask them to sit at tables to learn. We're doing center-based learning. We're doing hands-on learning. And that's really what Yusuf needed too. So not a huge surprise that he needed to be moving. Okay. Okay, now we're going to move into some case studies to see how we can put this all together. Those of you who are here live, could you use the chat box for just a minute and just tell me how the video quality was this morning? I want to kind of decide how many videos to use. Was the quality of that video I showed this morning okay? If you can use the chat box to let me know, that'd be great. Okay. Kathleen said yes. Beverly said it was okay. Okay. It may not be perfect. It might be a little grainy. It may be a little choppy, but I hope that you can still see the strategies in general. Patricia did say it was a little choppy too. Okay. So I think I'm going to go ahead and show them, but just know that they may not be perfect. It's just a bandwidth thing when we have go-to training combined with everything else that's going on. Okay, so when we're talking about implementing sensory diets at home, there are some general guidelines here, and a lot of these may look familiar to you if you've ever watched Super Nanny. I love Super Nanny. I think she's very common sense and very developmentally appropriate. And she always talked about one of the first things she did in every home was put a routine on the refrigerator, right? It helps the parents, it helps the kids. Kids need to know what to expect, and it's good for everybody. So I typically like to make the routines visual routines, whether they're verbal or not. Visual schedules and such are not just for nonverbal kids. It's just an easy way for a child to see what's going to be expected over this next period of time. So I think that's huge. Avoid getting in a rush is important. When my own girls were little, I was getting ready for work. I'm trying to get all of them out the door. And when I'm constantly saying, hurry, 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 my little over-responder was just getting more and more overstimulated. So, I just made myself get up about 20 minutes earlier so that I could be pretty much done with myself before I needed to help them get ready. And it just helped all of us, because then I could be like, okay, I'm ready. Now I can focus my time and attention on these kids. And it just made everything go smoother in the mornings. Promote independence and sensory input. We want them to be independent. So we want to structure the house so that they can be independent. Create a little cozy corner that they're free to go to. Create an area where they can get the vestibular input that they need, and encourage them. Good job. I noticed you were needing a sensory break, and I'm so glad that you took that, because now you're more in task. So we really want to recognize and validate those choices. I think most homes need an area of retreat. In some cases, that's the kids' bedrooms, but if they share a bedroom, it might need to be a little cozy corner in the room, or a little hideout behind the couch, or something like that, just so they know they have an area that's all theirs, that no demands will be placed on them when they're there, that they can go to get away when they're escalating. I always encourage parents to pick their battles. I've lived there, done that. I get it. It's tough. You see all these issues that your kids have, and you want to fix all of them at the same time, but it ends up causing everybody to be stressed out. So, I tell parents, if these are the target behaviors we're focusing on right now, let's just kind of let everything else go for the time being. Let's just focus our time and energy on these target behaviors, and we can add in the others later. So we start with the most critical, and then we work out from there. And then minimize screen time. A reason why this is so important is because not only cognitive development, but from a sensory standpoint, there are two major windows of opportunity where the majority of neuroplasticity takes place, where we can actually change the way the brain is structured. One is between birth and age 3, which most of us are pretty aware of. There's another good window between the ages of 10 and 13. And this is when a lot of neural pruning takes place, when too many connections have been formed. And so that neural pruning is only going to take place if they're getting proprioceptive and vestibular and tactile input. Those are the big three that contribute to neurological changes. And that's not going to happen if they're in front of a TV or an iPad or an iPod too much of the time, right? So what I tell parents is, it's not that what they're watching is necessarily bad or wrong. It's what they're missing out on that is the issue. And then sometimes that makes sense to parents. When kids can be playing educational games and watching educational shows 24 hours a day, a lot of parents just truly think that's good for them. And we need to educate them that, it might be good for their cognitive development, but there's so many other aspects that we need to consider. And so it's good to put that in language that the parents can understand. I just think the reason why we're seeing so many kids who are struggling with attention and focus and movement issues is it's just truly a societal change that's taken place. And we're changing the little brains by the way we're raising kids. It's just so different. When I was a kid, we walked to school. It was about a mile away. My brother and my neighbors, we all walked together to school. And then we walked home for lunch because we had a 1 hour lunch. We walked back. We walked home at the end of the day. So we walked 4 miles before we even got home. At school, we had 2 recesses a day. We had PE every day. When we got home, maybe there was one after school kids show on. I think that was only on Wednesdays, actually. And the rest of the time, there was nothing we were even interested in. So you know what we did? We went outside. We went outside until the mom screamed for us to come in for supper, and then we went outside again until it was dark. And that just led to natural sensory development. And now we contrast that with today. We're all super anxious about safety for good reasons, but we don't want our kids to play outside unsupervised. And so, when mine were little, I felt like, well, I got to be out there with him and I have a zillion other things to do tonight. So we may go outside for 30 minutes, but then we're coming in because I still have things to do, I drove him to the bus stop even because all I could think about was JC Dugard getting kidnapped on her country road, things like that. So, we're really protective, and which is good, but it also can hinder some aspects of development. Obviously, they get to school, they may have recess once a day, but many times we're in Michigan, many times they didn't. When we were in Texas, sometimes it got canceled because of ozone issues, so wherever you live, it can be an issue. And where nobody used to worry about that thing, they send us outside no matter what the temperature. Some schools have PE twice a week. They just don't get that much. And then they get home and they could happily be on their devices all night. And we think it's educational. And so right now, this current generation, they're the first ones who are truly growing up with devices in hand, and I really just fear for our future. I think we're changing the neurology to a large extent. Because a lot of homes just allow that. They think it's okay. And I really truly think they think that's good. It's a good thing. And it is in limitation. But anyway, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here. But I just think that's something we really need to be preaching and teaching to make sure the word gets out that just because they're educational doesn't mean that their bodies don't have the same needs that the bodies for the previous 6,000 years or however long need. We're really have a sudden change in how we are as a society. Okay. Anyway, in the home, we're still going to think about sensory breaks, routines, use of schedules, and modifications and adaptations. All right, this is a little girl named Jamie that I worked with. It's been a while. It's hard to get good case studies, so I kind of hang on to them once I get them. Jamie, her parents came to this parent night seminar that I did, and they came and talked to me afterwards, and they were just, frustrated because she's just quirky and they're not sure how best to help her. And they've had her to several different professionals, and one thinks it's all behavior, and one thinks it's all sensory, and one thinks she has bipolar, and so on. So they're just left thinking, how do we help our child? And I live about an hour from them, so I only wanted to commit to help if I thought I could. So I talked to the parents about what are the big issues you're seeing, and those 2 big issues became our target behaviors. One is that they said she literally wakes up crying, and she does not stop until we push her on the bus each morning. And then the other was this encopresis thing that we're not going to go into too much today. But it's like that extreme form of constipation we mentioned earlier that I've seen in under responders a few times, actually. Okay, so we're going to focus on the morning routine. Now, I thought, okay, so she wakes up crying. I don't know. if she has a lot of anxiety or depression. I'm not sure how much my sensory strategies will help. I'm not sure exactly what's going on. So I said to the mom, can you videotape the morning routine for me to see? And when I watched this video, I got excited because I thought, no matter what, even if it's anxiety, whatever it is, I still think I can help this child because I noticed how many positions and ways that she's moving that give her body a lot of proprioceptive input. So that tells me at some level her brain gets it. Her brain knows she needs more sensory input to be effective in the morning. She's just not exactly sure how to do that effectively. So that made me think I can help this child. Okay. Now, from her sensory assessment, I learned that she's under responsive to proprioceptive and vestibular input, and she's over responsive to visual and auditory input. And she definitely has some anxiety going on as well. Okay. So let's take a look at her video. Now, there are some social dynamics going on here too in the home, and we will talk about those too. But nonetheless, I want you to watch the video with thinking about what types of input it seems to be that she's seeking here. Okay, she was 6 at the time of this video. She has a diagnosis of speech delay, but no other diagnosis at that time. By the afternoon, she's kind of one of those kids that's bouncing off the walls, can get aggressive toward her siblings sometimes. But right now, we're really focusing on this morning issue of waking up crying. Okay, so take a look and note what you see. The original video was about 25 minutes. I've edited it for you.
Come on, James, time to get up. Honey, you got the same amount of sleep you get every night. It's time to get up.
Okay, for the live attendees, I just want you to note in the chat box, what do you notice off the top, right off the top here? We know she's over responsive to visual input. What do you notice? Add it to the chat box.
Come on, babe.
Right, you're all right. It's very bright, you know. In fact, we're not going to see her eyes for quite a while. The brightness is too much for her. You also notice everything's red. The walls are red. The comforter's red. That's a lot for somebody who's over responsive to visual input. That's a lot. Between the sun and the color, it's a lot to wake up to. She's still wearing pull-ups at nighttime, and it looks pretty soggy. So that also kind of is a clue to me that there's probably some interoceptive under-responsiveness.
It's the last day of school. You don't have to get up early no more. Let's go into the bathroom. I know. Oh, let's give you a squeeze. Let's go to the bathroom, babe.
Notice, you know, she's plopping herself, she's dragging her body down the rail, she's leaning. Those are some attempts to get more proprioceptive input, I believe. Still haven't seen her eyes. They've given
Okay,
up on having her stand up to get dressed. So this is what they do. I think she likes the full body contact with the floor because it's a lot of proprioceptive input to her body.
For you. 2, 1. Okay, here you go. Gotta get up and get dressed. 2, 1. Can't do it. It's your turn in there.
I think that's the first time she noticed the camera was on her. She hadn't looked up before that. Some more, you'll see a little bit more proprioceptive seeking, stomping, bangs her head occasionally, stomps her legs.
I'm too old. I hate this thing. You can do it, Jamie. No. You did the other one. Do it the same way. Okay, good job. You got all dressed all by yourself. You did it. Ready to go get some breakfast? Yeah? Okay, come on. Can I go to McDonald's? No, we're not going to go to McDonald's. Come on, we're going to go upstairs and have breakfast in the kitchen. Come on, stand up. You need to walk up the stairs. You can do it. Come on, babe. Let's go. All the way up.
Okay, I'm going to just mute it and talk over the rest of it. This is, she's crawling up the stairs too and plopped down on the floor. I think she is wanting more proprioceptive input. At some level, she thinks that'll be helpful for her because this is actually requiring more energy than standing up and walking would. So I think it's needing that proprioceptive input. Now, when I first watched this, I thought, yeah, she's crying, but I don't really see tears, So that made me wonder, could it just be behavior, like she's wanting more attention or something like that? I don't think that's what's going on here, though. These parents are both really laid back, and you can tell, like the mom is able to say, come on, keep moving, get a move on. Where I would probably be like, oh my gosh, get over here, I'm going to dress you myself, because it would drive me crazy. But this mom's not like that. So she remains very calm and cool and collected. She doesn't jump in and rescue Jamie. She doesn't do any of the work for her. She doesn't bribe her with McDonald's. So if it were behavioral, we should be able to see what she's getting out of it. She's not getting anything out of this. She's not getting task avoidance. She's not getting a lot of extra attention. The mom had 3 other kids and was currently pregnant. So she got more attention on this day just because she was recording. But typically, Jamie just keeps whining and crying. Nobody's even paying attention to her, other than just prompting from the mom when she walks by. So I don't think it's behavioral because she's not getting anything out of it, and yet it persists. So that leads me back to, I think it is sensory. Now, what I'm seeing is that she is over responsive to the brightness. So we want to start with adaptations and accommodations. My recommendation was to paint the room. They did not do that. I just thought a nice subtle shade might be better for her. And then I also asked for blinds or curtains, and they did do that. They did put those up so that she could wake up to a fairly dark room and then gradually open the blinds throughout the morning to get used to light gradually. So those are the accommodations and adaptations for what she's over responsive to. We didn't really do anything for the auditory component because it really wasn't very loud in their house in the morning. Now, she's under-responsive to propenvistib. Here's the thing about people who are under-responsive to movement. This is pretty common for them in the mornings, actually. A lot of people who are more on the under-responsive side are not morning people. They may be bouncing off the walls by the afternoon, but in the morning, they can't get going. Some of you may be like this. Some people get up an hour before they need to, so they have time to drink piping hot coffee and watch the news before they even get moving. They need that gradual transition to life. It's almost like under responders need a certain amount of sensory fuel poured in before before their brains are able to be effective. So hang on, I'm trying to get my webcam back. There we go. So I think that's what's going on with Jamie. And in thinking through that, I thought, well, let's just give her a transition time. Rather than making her get out of bed and get instantly into motion, let's allow her to just go to the couch and watch a 20-minute video as a transition. But the mom was afraid that the other kids would get sidetracked by that. So we thought of alternatives and we decided, let's set up a little cozy area under her loft bed. All she has to do is get out of bed and go sit in the cozy area for 10 minutes. And we put on country music with a visual timer. She wraps up in a weighted blanket. So she's getting just a good transition activity of gently getting used to the light, gently getting used to auditory input, giving her some deep pressure with the weighted blanket, the beanbag, just that transition piece that can be helpful for many of these kids. And after that, we're going to give her choice-based alerting vestibular and proprioceptive input. So here is, this is just common. She got choices. The mom would put on the must-dos. You got to get up, you got to get dressed, you got to eat breakfast, and you have to end up on the school bus. And then Jamie would get to select strategies along the way. We had this weighted blanket time first, and that was that transition piece. So I'm not necessarily using it as calming so much as just that transition time that a lot of under-responders need in the morning. And it helped because she knew all I have to get out of bed and go straight to that cozy corner, right? And then the rest were green and yellow arrow activities that she could choose to intersperse, like a scooter board to get to the bathroom, a hoppy ball to get to the kitchen table. And then kind of a motivator for her was that this is rural Michigan, so they had a big trampoline in the front yard, which was kind of cool because she could wait for the bus while jumping on the trampoline. And she looked forward to that trampoline time. So the quicker that she got ready, the more trampoline time she had. If this were a behavioral issue, transitioning from the trampoline to the bus would have been a bad idea. But at this point, I'm thinking, I think it's really, truly sensory. So I think that transition will go okay, and it did go fine. But you do have to think through those things. Putting something really fun before something not fun might be problematic. But for her, it served as an incentive to hurry so that she had a fair amount of trampoline time. Okay, now I'm going to show you her after video. With this program in place, we reduced parental prompting by about 45% and reduced the time of her morning routine from 45 minutes to about 25 minutes. So pretty good progress. Okay, sorry, here, let me open up her after video. It looks like they painted her room, but they didn't. She actually fell asleep in the parents' room that night, so that's why it looks different. That's something else I want to say, though. You know, I could tell the parents were very laid back. Everything's kind of in a state of disarray, you know, that kind of thing. I could just tell they were laid back. And whenever you see a really laid back family like that, it makes me wonder, like, do they have any routine in place? And if that's the case, she could just be tired. So those are questions to ask. And I think it's well within our scope of practice to want to know about the child's routine and how it's impacting them. So I asked the parents those questions, and it turns out this is one of those families where everybody just kind of falls asleep at some point in the evening in front of the TV on the living room floor or the couch, and the dad may or may not carry them to their own beds. So no routine in place. So I talked to the mom about routines being very important, and 8 o'clock's a very appropriate bedtime for her age, with a routine starting at 7 that ends with her getting into bed at 8. And I don't think there was much follow through there, but we try. Okay, so here is the after. And, you'll notice the mom is doing a good job of being more alerting with her voice, talking a little bit more up and forcefully and giving her some deep pressure pats and squeezes. So she's trying to be a little bit more stimulating as well, which is good. It's a dark video, so it's going to be a little hard to see in the beginning.
It's time to wake up now. I got your schedule here. You want to look at it? Oh, Cheetah's going to get you up. Says, get up, Jamie. Come on.
Ow.
Got a pretty good night's sleep now, girl. Come on. Sit up here and look at your schedule for a second.
No.
Here, come on.
Get up.
Just roll over. What you got to do this morning?
Get up.
And then what? Obstacle course?
Bathroom controls. 24 north, 04.
Look, Cheetah.
Exit 8.
All right. Let's rub those shoulders. Give you a little massage. Drag it in there. It's your sandbox, yep. Okay, tuck it under there. Here's your blanket.
Okay, so you can see she's not crying. She knows mentally all she has to do is go to that beanbag. Now, usually this is already set up, but again, it's kind of one of those families that things get moved. It's usually a weighted blanket, but they had left it at the grandparents the day before. So, you know, it's not ideal, but it's good. And you can see that it's helping her. And then she sits there listening to country music until the timer goes off. And then she's ready. Like, it's that change alone would have almost been enough, just giving her that transition time. She starts out with the blinds partially open, and then when the mom comes back in to say the timer's off, they go ahead and open them when she moves into the bathroom and so forth. So this change alone was huge, but we still had the other strategies in place to keep giving her more of that stimulating input that she needs in order to become effective. Okay. All right, next little guy is Gabe. Gabe is over-responsive to vestibular, auditory, and tactile input. The parents had a few target behaviors, but the one that you're going to see is hair cutting, just because I want you to see how this can look for a littler person and how we can structure this program for a little guy. So we decided to use First Then for him because of his age. He was 3. And he's in his home. His parents are both teachers, so they were both home full-time this summer. So it's pretty ideal as far as carryover goes, which is probably why we see good results too. And we don't want his whole day to be structured since he's a little boy with stay-at-home parents for the summer. But we just decided if we can use the First Then system for the first 30 or 40 minutes to make sure that we hit on all of the major things that we want to work on through our sensory program, then the rest of his day, we'll just make it developmentally appropriate. I talked to the parents about the importance of going to the playground, even though Gabe doesn't want to go to the playground. He's the type of kid, as an overresponder, he would be perfectly happy snuggling up on the couch and reading books most of the day. He doesn't like the playground because it's noisy and it's scary and he doesn't really like to move. But I talked to the parents that even though he doesn't like it, it's good for him. He needs to learn to ride his trike, even though he's not interested. So these parents got it. They were teachers. They understood. So they were willing to push him with those things a little bit, and he made good progress. But okay, let me show you his before video. So knowing that he's over responsive to auditory, tactile, and visual input, you can imagine, I'm sorry, vestibular, auditory, and tactile input, you can imagine why haircutting is difficult. Even the vestibular component, because the clippers cause vibration, and that elicits a vestibular response. Oops, that keeps going away. Hang on here. Okay, Gabe. Let's see if it's going to work.
Gonna cut your hair now.
Okay.
Okay, Daddy, can you plug this in? All right, Gabe. You want to help me turn it on?
No.
Right here. Honey, I'm gonna cut your hair now. No, hit it. Is that scary? Have some chocolate after I cut your hair. Okay? Stop. Put your hand down.
Okay. You know, I often hear people say the clippers are scary, and they are scary, but, you know, he's seen them multiple times. Most kids can get used to that. They've tried scissors, but he resists those too, and that's more dangerous in the long run. And I always just support parents in that. If this is going to be the easiest for the long term, then we'll just find a way to make that, to make it work. And then, you know, I also hear people saying he doesn't need a haircut, but really these parents are being good parents, because what most of us do when our kids hate something is we just avoid it. And that's not really a very good long-term policy. In fact, when our kids hate something that's necessary in life, it's really better to do it more frequently. And that's what they decided. We're just going to cut his hair every other week, because hopefully he'll get used to it. And I think that's good. In fact, once we started working on this, we decided that he's going to get his haircut every Friday, every single week, because that gives him more chances to habituate to it. And so overall, I think that's the best way to go. Okay, now let's go with after. This is 6 weeks later, and I'll talk about what his sensory diet looked like in a minute.
Cheese. Hi.
Now we're gonna put it around your shoulders and do your head. All right?
No, out of my head.
Got your airplane?
Yeah, take it off.
Cozy, cozy, cozy. All right. Good job. He's my good boy.
Help.
Help? What do you need help with?
I need help with the body. I need help with the body.
With the what?
He was actually saying, I need help with the buzz, please. So the auditory part of it was still bothering him, but he was doing so much better. Now, some of the strategies you saw, like Mom started out with the towel on his head to be a buffer while he got used to the noise and the vibration. That was great. She then moved the towel to swaddle him from some deep pressure input. She allowed him to have a preferred object with him. You can't really see, but before his legs were dangling, now his legs are on the edge of the bathtub so that he's really stable. That's important for a child who's over responsive to vestibular input. They need to feel very rooted, very, very secure. So those are some strategies that are helping him in the moment. Now, for his overall sensory program, we used a first then system for him because of his age. And we just went through, he followed that for his morning routine. The first was that they got up and they did the brushing protocol on him because of the amount of tactile over responsiveness he displayed. That was a good way to start his day, and he enjoyed it. And the then was a choice-based activity. Mostly for his choice-based activities, we gave him vestibular options, and we were giving him calming vestibular. The reason for that is, first of all, we wanted the calming impact, but second, I wanted to gradually expand his tolerance for vestibular input throughout the summer. So we started with really non-threatening forms of vestibular input, and then gradually increased the demands of the task a little bit. And, they're tiny house, no equipment. So it doesn't have to take much for little kids, though. And they don't need very many choices. 2 or 3 are fine. So his choices were the quilt swing, where each parent would get 2 sides of the quilt and he'd be in it, and they'd swing him slow and linearly. That was one choice. One choice was to be on the therapy ball with Daddy. He was way too scared of vestibular input to be on it by himself, but he loved his daddy and he felt very secure with Daddy. So Daddy would hold him on his lap and they would just rock back and forth on the ball. That was one choice. The laundry basket ride. He would sit in the laundry basket and they would pull him around. Not very fast because he didn't want to go very fast, but he did like that sensation. And in the laundry basket, he'd be in flexion. So those were his choices. And then over the course of the summer, we started to increase it a little bit. Like once he was good on the therapy ball with Daddy, then before too long, the Daddy could hold his hips and rock him back and forth, and he'd be on it by himself. And by the end of the summer, he could be over the ball on his tummy, and Daddy could have a hand on his back and rock him back and forth. So those are still choice-based activities, but we're just kind of increasing the demands of the task a little bit so that he becomes more tolerant of movement through space. Okay, so those were the then activities. And then the first activity was he had to wash his face, and he hated getting water on his face. So that's just good old-fashioned desensitization. If you hate it, we're going to make sure it happens every day, but nicely, so that you will get used to it, because you will get used to it, and you just have to for life. And all he had to do was get his hands wet, splash it on, and then wipe it off, and then move on to the calming activity that's choice-based. The next first was brushing his hair. And this is just because, again, desensitization. I bought him a vibrating hairbrush. You can get them off Amazon, because I thought that'll help him get used to the feel and the sound of vibration. He hated it. So the first week, Mom would turn it on, and he just had to touch it long enough to turn it off. The second week, he had to turn it on and count to 5 and turn it off. The third week, he had to turn it on and brush 1, 2, 3 and turn it off. And by the end of the summer, he could brush 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and turn it off. So we're just gradually increasing the demands and then calm him down. And then the next first was messy play. We started with Play-Doh. He didn't like to touch food. He didn't want to touch anything. This was just one more of his target behaviors. So when I first brought out my Play-Doh the first day, he kind of just gagged, just a teeny tiny gag, but you could see it at the idea of it. So I don't want, you don't want to stress him out too much. You start with that just right, a challenge. So the first week he just had to pound it with his fists, and the second week he poked it with his finger, and the third week he made little balls, and by the end of the summer, he's rolling his hands. He looks like a typically developing kid playing with Play-Doh. But in that after video, it's funny because the mom said, "How does the Play-Doh feel, Gabe?" And he said, "It feels angry." So I think he still didn't love it completely, but he had come really far. And then calm him down. So that's taken us through his morning program. Then for the rest of the day, developmentally appropriate, using his body, becoming desensitized, utilizing that neuroplasticity available at birth of 3. So he came really far in a short amount of time with that in place. Okay, now let's switch gears to sensory diets at school. We haven't taken a brain break. For those of you who are here live, let's just do that really quickly. Let's just do good old-fashioned proprioceptive input. You all should stand up if you've been sitting this whole time. And I'm going to say this out loud for those of you who are watching the View on Demand version, so you can participate as well. This is a good brain break for older kids because there's nothing embarrassing involved, just pure proprioceptive input. I'm going to stay seated for the live people who can see my camera because you'll be able to see more of me, but I want you to go ahead and stand up. Now reach your arms up toward the ceiling, push up on your tippy toes, go up as high as you can, try to reach the ceiling, stretch, stretch, stretch up on your tiptoes. Come down on your heels. Engage your core by pulling your belly button toward your spine. If your core is engaged, you can put your hands together and press down really firmly through the top of your head to give yourself good deep pressure input through your spine and brain. Push down really firmly. Come back up one more time, up on your tippy toes. Stretch, stretch, stretch. Now come down on your heels, arms out to your sides. Imagine what it would feel like if you were just kind of gently being pulled apart. So try to stretch so far in each direction that your joint surfaces extract. Now come together at midline, like you're going to say your prayers, and push really firmly. I always tell kids, if I can't see your muscles shaking, you're not pushing hard enough. Push, push, push. Out to the sides again. Bring your hands down to your lower back and try to squeeze your elbows together. Okay, back out to the sides. Now, if you're standing up, you're going to just bend over and let your body dangle. So go ahead and bend over, let your body dangle. And then roll up slowly, vertebrae by vertebrae, till your shoulders are back, stomach is in. Take a couple belly breaths. Okay, now sit back down. We're in for the home stretch now, just about 15 more minutes. I know this is a long time to be seated and participate in a webinar of all things, but I hope you like the convenience of not having to travel for it at least. Those of you watching the view on demand, you have the option of starting and stopping, which is helpful, right? Okay, so let's talk about sensory diets at school. These are just some general guidelines. Minimize visual busyness. Think about a 1 or 2 color scheme rather than every color in the rainbow. Modulating music or metronomes. Frequent movement breaks. Alternative seating options. Fluorescent lights are hard for many of us. A place of retreat and access to modulating tools like weighted lap pads and more. So these are things that ideally would be in place for all kids. I think the more that we become a sedentary society, the more that all of us are going to need these types of strategies to be available to us. Okay, here are some tips on introducing the program to the entire classroom. I usually start introducing this, like if it's a lower grade, during circle time, where we talk about cars can go fast, and our bodies can go fast, and our brains can go fast, and we act it out together, you know? And I get out my toy cars. Cars can go slow, and our bodies can go slow, and our brains can go slow, and we act it out together. And then, and so forth. And each day I might, or usually it's the teacher who does it, but I'm helping her know what to introduce in what order. And then each day we might introduce 2 or 3 sensory activities. And we talk about how do we feel before, how do we feel after. Then we add the picture card to our chart that we can choose from. And so it's a good way to start helping people own what they need to do. Some teachers want to do movement breaks that everybody participates in together. Others are okay with a little bit more flexibility. Like we have 10 minutes. Those of you who need alerting, go to that corner. If you need calming, go over here. Just right back to the back of the room. And then there's pictures in those areas, and they can engage in sensory strategies that are more specific to their needs at that time. We can also establish rules and limits. Some teachers use like a popsicle stick method. Like if there's a tent in the classroom, everybody kind of needs to get away once in a while. So if you need to get away and go study in the tent, then she has, to keep that from becoming task avoidance, what some teachers do is use a cup with popsicle sticks on it. And everybody's name might go on 2 popsicle sticks, meaning you get 2 each week with your name on it. If you go to the tent, your popsicle stick goes in the cup. And then when your popsicle sticks are gone, you can't go anymore that week. So that could be a way of controlling how many times a kid goes to prevent it from being task avoidance. One teacher I knew, she had a couple kids who needed to go daily at least. So she put their name on like 10 popsicle sticks so they could go twice a day. But she was just very honest with the class and said some people's brains work better after they're in the tent for a while. Other people, it's kind of fun, but it's not necessarily helpful to their brain, and they need different tools to help their brain. So some of you are going to have more popsicle sticks than others, and that's just because it's what I figured out works for some people's brains. And so that way nobody questioned why somebody went more than others. Here's an example of a program I set up back when I was using Stick Kids, and but did something similar with the visuals there. The kids could choose from when they needed to. Okay, now we're going to talk about. Let me see here a second. You know what? I think I'm going to skip Debbie in the interest of time and do Ethan, because I think Ethan is a little bit better of an example for something that many of us struggle with. Many of us think, I know what that child needs, but he refuses to engage in the sensory strategies that would be helpful for him. And so Ethan was one of those kids. He was a really interesting kid. He was in a classroom for kids with autism, but autism never seemed exactly like the right diagnosis for him either, but I guess it was better than anything else. Anyway, hard classroom. There were 3 adults and 4 kids in this classroom, so pretty good ratio. Somebody was always having a meltdown in that classroom. Anyway, Ethan was a big kid for his age, and he would, very overweight. He was tall too, but mostly just very chubby. He would walk into the room, lay down flat on the floor, pull the big red beanbag over him, and that's all he wanted to do. And so if you approached him with any intention of getting anything done, he became really mean and aggressive, and we were all kind of afraid of Ethan. One of his favorite things to do was reach his hand deep down in his diaper and bring it up and scratch you with it, so we'd get feces, infected wounds, and so forth. This was Texas, so we turned the air down in that room and wore denim jackets to protect ourselves. So he was a hard kid, and I'm looking at him and I'm thinking, wow, he's an extreme over-responder. He doesn't want to engage in anything. He can't handle anything besides proprioceptive input. And that's because we as a species are not over-responsive to that. And sure enough, I had his parent fill out a checklist and his teacher fill out a checklist, and just across the board, over-responsive. Our target behavior, we had no idea how to even write goals for him. He was new to the district, came with nothing. And so we just decided, well, we know we can't educate him if he's hiding under the beanbag. So our first goal was that Ethan will remain in an upright position for 3 minutes while engaged in a functional activity. That's where we started. We decided to use a first then approach with him, which meant nothing to him initially. He didn't have choice making. He didn't get cause and effect. He had no basic concept. So it took time to teach that. And then we worked on gradually increasing his activity time tolerance. And we were hoping to find some preferred activities to expand his then options. So here's how we started with him. He didn't want to do anything. So initially we just started with physically sitting him up. And it took 3 of us to do that, to keep anyone from getting hurt. And we set the timer for 10 seconds. And our unspoken message is, we are keeping you here for 10 seconds until the timer goes off, no matter how hard you fight us. So we just physically set him up and didn't let him go back under the beanbag until the timer went off. But we started with 10 seconds, so it wasn't too bad. And then, all done, now you get the beanbag. So we're just wanting him. I worked very closely with the speech therapist and the teacher. We worked together on this. And so the speech therapist was just really wanting him to get this basic first then concept, do what we need you to do, then you get what you want. The red beanbag is the only thing he wanted. It's not a functional activity. We're not functional at this point. This is just where we had to start to kind of make friends with him, to help him get our first then system, to get him on board with some kind of system. So this is where we had to start. Once he was tolerating 10 seconds without extreme aggression, then we increased it, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. By the way, we're not treating this behaviorally at all. Even if he tried to kill all 3 of us during that 30 seconds, which he occasionally did try, Still, when the timer goes off, all done, now it's time for your beanbag. This is not a reward, it's just the next thing on the schedule. So that's what we're wanting him to get, okay? Once he got to 30 seconds, we thought that's long enough for a task instead of a timer. So this is another cognitive leap now. We're taking away the timer and we're putting in a task. That's a pretty big cognitive leap. So we want to start with something very simple, very basic. We just started with a block, a wooden block, and a coffee can. You have to put the wooden block in the coffee can, and then you get the beanbag. And that's just a cognitive leap because he didn't get our system yet. So we helped him, hand over hand, block in the coffee can. Yay, good job, now you get your beanbag. So once he understood that now it's tied to task completion rather than timer, it started to click with him and he got fast. He'd sit up, block in the coffee can, dive under the beanbag chair. So now he gets it. He gets first then, he gets the concept of task completion being the requirement. So now we can start increasing the demands. And he had pretty good motor skills. So it wasn't much time at all before he could sit up and do something like this. And he would be fast because he wanted the beanbag. Boom, 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 dive under the beanbag chair, right? About this time, I start thinking, I don't want his only then to be the red beanbag chair because he's just continuing to escape life and sensory input. So I started experimenting with different types of sensory strategies that I'm hoping can someday be the then activities, but I introduced them during the first. And sometimes I put them with a timer, like we are going to play with this toy until the timer goes off. And I could tell, does he like it? Does he hate it? If he liked it, then that could become a choice-based option for then. For example, I figured out that he liked this, it's called a string-a-ma-thing. You turn it on and this colorful string blows out and in a loop and it's really visually mesmerizing. He liked a lot of those visual toys and tools. But those were good choices for him from a sensory standpoint because if he chose one of those, then we required him to stay upright to engage with them. So now we're going back and forth, first then, keeping him upright for longer periods of time. We never presented the red beanbag chair as a choice unless we wanted him to choose it. And sometimes we did. We knew he'd always choose it just because they couldn't keep up that stuff ratio all day anyway. So they would allow him to choose the beanbag. He would get a break. They would get a break and move on. So now we have more options with sensory strategies to use as thens that allowed us to keep him upright. And we were pretty proud of ourselves by the end of the year where he would remain upright. It was he found this little wooden rocking chair in the room that he really had to squeeze to get into because it was almost too small for him. But I think he liked that squeeze. And then we had kind of a tiny work table in front of him. And he would remain upright in that setting for 45 to 60 minutes, often, unless something loud and unexpected happened. Like if somebody else went into full-on meltdown mode, he'd be out of that chair and under the beanbag. But for the most part, we could go back and forth, first then. Then we would eventually throw the red beanbag chair in as a choice. And he would typically choose it at that time. Okay, we made it. I know that's a long day if you're watching this all in one sitting. But we made it, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm going to stay online for questions from the live participants. People who are watching this in view on demand format, feel free to email me if questions come up, gwen@sensationalbrain.com. Those of you who are here live, feel free to use the chat box to ask me questions, or if you want to, you can click on the hand icon to raise your electronic hand, and I will call on you and unmute your speaker, and you can ask your question out loud if it's easier to do so. Either way is fine with me. Now, I am going to stay online for questions, but in the meantime, I want to go ahead and give you end of the day instructions, and you can go ahead and do this now if you'd like to also. To get CEUs, you must take our post test. And so here's the link. This link will also come in a follow-up email that you live people will be receiving in about an hour. So you can take it later if you want to. You do not have to take it now. People who are watching the view on demand version, the instructions are below the video on your video screen that you're watching. You may have to exit out of full screen mode to see the instructions, but you should be able to click directly on a link there to go to your post test. When you get to the post test page, the password is DIET, and that is lowercase, DIET. If you're an OT, you will receive a course certificate that shows 0.6 AOTA CEUs that you can hold on to and submit for your licensure purposes. If you're a teacher or another professional, the certificate should suffice for you for CE hours. If you're a speech therapist, we will still send you a certificate of completion after you pass your post-test, but then we upload the attendance records and course completion records in your participation form to ASHA CE registry, and your CEUs will show up there soon. We have 45 days from course completion to submit that, so it may be a little while, but they will be there soon, and that's how you get your ASHA CEUs for course participation. Let's see, we also have a course evaluation that we greatly appreciate you completing. It's on SurveyMonkey, so there's a link provided here too, where you can tell us what worked well, what you liked, what we may do differently in the future. And it's also a good place to tell us topics that you would like us to present on in the future as well. So we appreciate your participation that way, and you're free to go ahead and do either or both of those two things now. What did I just do? Okay, what I wanted to do was, for the people who are attending live, I'm going to copy and paste this text link to your chat box. And you guys should be able to click directly on that link to take the post-test now. Remember, when you get there, the password that you enter is DIET, D-I-E-T, all lowercase. Okay? If you don't pass the post-test for some reason, review your course materials and take it again. That's fine. Or you can email me if there's questions or if you disagree about an answer and want to explain that. Okay? So I'm just going to stay on for a little bit and see if there are any questions from our live attendees. Okay, I see some questions coming in. Patricia said, do you ever use nystagmus as an indication of responsiveness to vestibular stim? I do, Patricia. There are some instructions you can find online and even videos about testing post-rotary nystagmus. It's a pretty specific test in general, where we spend 10 times in one direction and you're rotating about one rotation every 2 seconds in general, and then you go the other way, and then I'm stopping them and looking at how long you see the nystagmus. Excessive nystagmus usually represents over-responsiveness to vestibular input. Lack of a nystagmus or very little usually shows under responsiveness to vestibular input, and that is typically played out clinically too with kids that I see either seeking or avoiding movement. So I do use it. I can get pretty good information just through observation of how they're acting too, but I do use it. Kathleen said, my understanding was that proprioception issues were perceptual or seeking based. I'm not sure. Let me see if you explain it more. I've heard you mention hypo to proprioceptive, but I thought we didn't use hypo or hyper to probe. Well, there are people who cannot get enough proprioceptive input, and hypo responsiveness just means under responsiveness. It's just kind of a different term for it. I should be using under responsiveness more, but that's just kind of an old habit. But it means the same thing. So what that can mean is that they just always want more. We as a species are not over-responsive to it, but we can be under-responsive to it. So that may be where the confusion came from. So usually proprioceptive issues are, in fact, seeking in nature. They're usually wanting more. We don't see people who are over-responsive to proprioceptive input. I hope that makes sense. Let's see. What about fading? In Jamie's case, will she always need this whole strip in the morning, or would you start fading this at some point? Yes, I start fading it when I see they don't need it anymore. Once she started to own some strategies, it was probably about 9 months that they used this, the whole next following school year. But she started to get it. She just knew there were 2 things that were really helpful to her over time. That transition time was very important to her and continued to be. For a few years. Another thing that she realized is she liked hot showers in the morning. So she'd have her time in her beanbag chair, and then she'd go take a hot shower. And many of us use a hot shower as that transition piece two that helps us get going in the morning. And so she stopped taking baths at nighttime and started taking showers in the morning. And as long as those two strategies were in place, she no longer needed the schedule strip from that point on. She had matured some. I continued to work with her on and off, and she did well and no longer needed that. So yeah, you can definitely start fading once you see that the routine is going well and that they understand what their sensory needs are and that they're meeting them on their own. The norms for post-rotarrhea nystagmus are published in research. Right. It's typically about 10 seconds, depending on the age, but that's a normal amount of time if you're following the 10 rotations in one direction, 10 in the other at a fairly slow revolution rate. But all of that is posted online, the specific protocol for testing, and you can watch YouTube videos to see how that's tested too. And then Kathleen Atta, what I see most of the time is kids seeking proprioceptive input due to over-responsiveness to another type of input. That's mostly what I see too, just like with wrist biting. They're seeking oral proprioceptive input, but it's mainly because there's something else that's driving them crazy in the environment. We see that with head banging. We see it with kids who want tight squeezes. It's usually because there's something else that they're having an over-responsive reaction to. So that's a good point, Kathleen, and that's what I see the most too. She said, do you use the structured clinical observations of sensory integration in your school-based evals? I don't often use those. I kind of use them informally. I don't use the structured clinical observations. You can find those online too, by the way. But they look at things like, if I'm thinking of the same thing you're thinking of, they're looking at like, can the child hold what I call the Superman position, where they're prone and they're lifting up their arms and their legs simultaneously, holding the flexion position, those kinds of observations. So I do use them, but I guess I've just been doing this enough that I do it more informally rather than a structured setting. Kathleen provided the name Erna Blanche. Yeah, I forgot about that even, her name, but you can look that up online. It's good, especially if you're kind of new to this. It gives you some good information about how they're processing, particularly proprioceptive and vestibular input and how they're able to motor plan from that. So that does give you some good information. I guess the other thing too is that when I'm a school-based therapist, I'm mainly looking at modulation. So I feel like for that, the checklists are a little bit more helpful rather than those structured observations, but they do give you some good information to go from. And they're kind of fun. You're welcome. Any other questions before we sign off today? Okay, well, please remember to set up your free membership soon if you haven't already done so. Please email me to request your kit if you already have a membership, whether you are a live or a view on demand attendee, and make sure to include your shipping address in that request, and we'll get it shipped soon. And I think that's all of the instructions for the day. Feel free to email me if any questions come up in the future. But otherwise, thank you all for being here. Those of you who are here live and those of you who are going to watch the video in the future, thank you as well. And I hope it's a format that you find to be beneficial for you. So thank you all, and I hope that you have a great weekend.